almost glad to see him, a reaction for which she despised herself, considering it a weakness. She was not sure how long she had been waiting, could not be sure unless someone told her, but she knew it had been a shorter period than before. Still, the wait had felt interminable, and she had feared that she was to be left strapped down and isolated, though not ignored, surely not that, for the same drawn-out stretch. To her disgust, she found herself grateful that the man was going to visit her more often than she had originally thought. Lying motionless on a flat piece of stone for so many hours was painful enough, but to be denied contact with any other living creature, even one as lumpish and abhorrent as her jailer, was a torture in and of itself and was by far the harder trial to bear. As the man unlocked her from her restraints, she noted that the wound on his forearm had been healed. The skin was as smooth and pink as a suckling pig's. She refrained from fighting, but on the way to the privy room, she pretended to stumble and fall, hoping to get near enough to the platter that she might steal the small paring knife the man used to cut the food. However, the platter proved too far away, and the man was too heavy for her to drag toward it without alerting him to her intentions. Her ploy having failed, she forced herself to submit calmly to the rest of the man's ministrations. She needed to convince him that she had given up so he would grow complacent and, if she was lucky, careless. While he fed her, she studied his fingernails. Previously, she had been too angry to pay them heed, but now that she was calmer, the oddity of them fascinated her. His nails were thick and highly arched. They were set deep within the flesh, and the white moons by the cuticles were large and broad. In all, no different from the nails of many of the men and dwarves she had dealt with. When had she dealt with them? She did not remember. What set his nails apart was the care with which they had been cultivated. And cultivated seemed the right description to her, as if the nails were rare flowers a gardener had devoted long hours to tending. The cuticles were neat and trim, with no sign of tears, while the nails themselves had been cut straight across, not too long, not too short, and the edges smoothly beveled. The tops of the nails had been polished until they shone like glazed pottery, and the skin surrounding them looked as if oil or butter had been rubbed into it. Except for elves, she had never seen a man with such perfect nails. Elves? She shook off the thought, irritated with herself. She knew no elves. The nails were an enigma, a strangeness in an otherwise understandable setting, a mystery that she wanted to solve, even though it was probably futile to try. She wondered who was responsible for the nail's exemplary condition. Was it the man himself? He seemed overly fastidious, and she could not imagine he had a wife or daughter or servant or anyone else close to him who would lavish so much attention on the caps of his fingers. Of course, she realized she might be mistaken. Many a battle-scarred veteran, grim, close-mouthed men whose only love seemed to be wine, women, and war, had surprised her with some facet of their character that was at odds with their outward guise. A knack for wood carving, a tendency to memorize romantic poems, a fondness for hounds, or a fierce devotion to a family that they kept hidden from the rest of the world. It had been years before she had learned that Jor. She cut off the thought before it went any further. In any event, the question she kept turning over in her mind was a simple one. Why? Motivation was telling, even when such small things as fingernails were concerned. If the nails were the work of someone else, then they were a labor of either great love or great fear. But she doubted that was the case. Somehow it felt wrong. If, instead, they were the work of the man himself, then any number of explanations were possible. Perhaps his nails were a way for him to exert a modicum of control over a life that was no longer his own. Or perhaps he felt they were the only part of himself that was or could be attractive. Or perhaps caring for them was merely a nervous tic, a habit that served no other purpose except to while away the hours. Whatever the truth might be, the fact remained that someone had cleaned and trimmed and buffed and oiled his fingernails, and it had not been a casual or inattentive effort. She continued to ponder the matter while she ate, barely tasting her food. Occasionally, she glanced up to search the man's heavy face for one clue or another, but always without success. Upon feeding her the last piece of bread, the man pushed himself off the edge of the slab, picked up the platter, and turned away. She chewed and swallowed the bread as fast as she could without choking. Then, her voice hoarse and creaky from disuse, she said, "You have nice fingernails. They're very shiny." The man paused in mid-step, and his large, ponderous head swiveled toward her. For a moment, she thought he might strike her again, but then his gray lips slowly split and he smiled at her, showing both his upper and lower rows of teeth. She suppressed a shudder. He looked as if he were about to bite the head off a chicken. Still with the same unsettling expression, the man continued out of her range of sight, and a few seconds later, she heard the door to her cell open and close. Her own smile crept across her lips. Pride and vanity were weaknesses that she could exploit. If there was one thing she was skilled at, it was the ability to bend others to her will. The man had given her the tiniest of handholds, no more than a finger hold, really, or rather a fingernail hold, as it were, but it was all she needed. Now she could begin to climb. The Hall of the Soothsayer. The third time the man visited her, Nasuda was sleeping. The sound of the door banging open caused her to jolt awake, heart pounding. It took her a few seconds to remember where she was. When she did, she frowned and blinked, trying to clear her eyes. She wished she could rub them. Her frown deepened as she looked down her body and saw that there was still a small damp spot on her shift where a drop of watered wine had fallen during her meal. Why has he returned so soon? Her heart sank as the man walked past her carrying a large copper brazier full of charcoal, which he set upon its legs a few feet away from the slab. Resting in the charcoal were 3 long irons. The time she had dreaded had finally arrived. She tried to catch his eye, but the man refused to look at her as he took flint and steel from a pouch on his belt and lit a nest of shredded tinder in the center of the brazier. As sparks smoldered and spread, the tinder glowed like a ball of red-hot wires. The man bent, puckered his lips, and blew on the incipient fire, gentle as a mother kissing her child, and the sparks sprang into lambent flames. For several minutes, he tended the fire, building a bed of coals several inches thick, the smoke rising to a grate far above. She watched with morbid fascination, unable to tear her gaze away, despite what she knew awaited her. Neither he nor she spoke. It was as if they were both too ashamed of what was about to take place for either to acknowledge it. He blew on the coals again, then turned as if to approach her. "Don't give in," she told herself, stiffening. She clenched her fists and held her breath as the man walked toward her, closer, closer. A feather-like touch of wind brushed her face as he strode past her, and she listened to his footsteps dwindle into silence as he climbed the stairs and left the room. A faint gasp escaped her as she relaxed slightly. Like lodestones, the bright coals drew her gaze back toward them. A dull, rust-colored glow was creeping up the iron rods that stuck out of the brazier. She wet her mouth and thought how nice a drink of water would be. One of the coals jumped and split in two, but otherwise the chamber was quiet. As she lay there, unable to fight or escape, she strove not to think. Thinking would only weaken her resolve. Whatever was going to happen was going to happen, and no amount of fear or anxiety could change that. New footsteps sounded in the hallway outside the chamber. A group of them this time, some marching in rhythm, some not. Together they created a host of raucous echoes that made it impossible to determine the number of people approaching. The procession stopped by the doorway, and she heard voices murmuring, and then 2 sets of clacking footsteps, the product of hard-soled riding boots, she guessed, entered the room. The door closed with a hollow thud. Down the stairs the footsteps came, steady and deliberate. She saw someone's arm place a carved wooden chair at the very edge of her vision. A man sat in it. He was large, not fat, but broad-shouldered. A long black cape hung draped around him. It looked heavy, as if backed with mail. Light from the coals and from the flameless lantern gilded the edges of his form, but his features remained too dark to make out. Still, the shadows did nothing to hide the outline of the sharp, pointed crown that rested upon his brow. Her heart skipped a beat. With a struggle, it resumed its previous rapid tempo. A second man, this one dressed in a maroon jerkin and leggings, both trimmed with gold thread, walked over to the brazier and stood with his back to her while he stirred the coals with one of the iron rods. One by one, the man in the chair tugged on the fingers of his gauntlets. Then he pulled off the gloves. Underneath, his hands were the color of tarnished bronze. When he spoke, his voice was low, rich, and commanding. Any bard who possessed such a mellifluous instrument would have his name praised throughout the land as a master of masters. The sound of it caused her skin to prickle. His words seemed to wash over her like warm waves of water, caressing her, beguiling her, binding her. Listening to him, she realized, was as perilous as listening to Elba. "Welcome to Urubayan, Nasuda, daughter of a jihad," said the man in the chair. "Welcome to this, my home, neath these ancient, piled rocks. Long has it been since a guest as distinguished as yourself has graced us with their presence. My energies have been occupied elsewhere, but I assure you, from now on, I shall not neglect my duties as host." At the last, a note of menace crept into his voice, like a claw emerging from its sheath. She had never seen Galbatorix in person, only heard descriptions and studied drawings, but the effect the man's speech had on her was so visceral, so powerful, she had no doubt that he indeed was the king. In both his accent as well as his diction, there was something of the other, as if the language he spoke was not the language he had been raised with. It was a subtle difference, but impossible to ignore once she noticed. Perhaps, she decided, it was because the language had changed in the years since he had been born. That seemed the most reasonable explanation, as his way of speaking reminded her. No, it reminded her of nothing. He leaned forward, and she could feel his gaze boring into her.
Greetings.
You are younger than I expected.
Traveler,
I knew you had but recently come of age, but still, you are no more than a child. Most seem as children to me these days, prancing, preening, foolhardy children who know not what is best for them, children who need the guidance of those who are older and wiser. Such as yourself, she said in a scornful tone. She heard him chuckle. Would you rather the elves ruled over us? I am the only one of our race who can hold them at bay. By their reckoning, even our oldest graybeards would be considered untested youths, unfit for the responsibilities of adulthood. By their reckoning, so would you. She did not know where her courage came from, but she felt strong and defiant. Whether or not the king would punish her for it, she was determined to speak her mind. Ah, but I contain more than my share of years. The memories of hundreds are mine. Life piled upon life. Loves, hates, battles, victories, defeats, lessons learned, mistakes made, all lie within my mind, whispering their wisdom into my ears. I remember eons. In the whole of recorded history, there has never been one such as I, not even among the elves. How is that possible? She whispered. He shifted in the chair. Do not think to pretend with me, Nisuda. I know that Gladder gave his heart of hearts to Aragon and Saphira, and that he is there, with the Varden, even now. You understand whereof I speak. She suppressed a thrill of fear. The fact that Galbatorix was willing to discuss such things with her, that he was willing to refer, even obliquely, to the source of his power, eliminated what little hope she still had that he ever intended to release her. Then he gestured at the room with his gauntlets. Before we proceed, you should know something of the history of this place. When the elves first ventured to this part of the world, they discovered a crevice buried deep within the escarpment that looms over the plains hereabout. The escarpment they prized as defense against the attacks of dragons, but the crevice they prized for an entirely different reason. By happenstance, they discovered that the vapors rising out of the crack in the stone increased the chances that those who slept near it might catch a glimpse, if however confused, of future events. So, over 2,500 years ago, the elves built this room atop the fissure, and an oracle came to live here for many hundreds of years, even after the elves abandoned the rest of Illyria. She sat where you now lie, and she whiled away the centuries dreaming of all that had been and all that might be. In time, the air lost its potency and the oracle and her attendants departed. Who she was and where she went, none can say for sure. She had no name other than the title soothsayer, and certain stories lead me to believe she was neither elf nor dwarf but something else entirely. Be that as it may, during her residency, this chamber came to be called, as you might expect, the Hall of the Soothsayer, and so it still is today, only now you are the soothsayer, Nisuda, daughter of a jihad. Galbatorix spread his arms. This is a place for truths to be told, and heard. I will tolerate no lies within these walls, not even the simplest of falsehoods. Whosoever rests upon that hard block of stone becomes the latest soothsayer, and though many have found that role difficult to accept, in the end, none have refused. You will be no different. The legs of the chair scraped over the floor, and then she felt Galbatorix's breath warm against her ear. I know this will be painful for you, Nisuda, painful beyond belief. You will have to unmake yourself before your pride will allow you to submit. In all the world, nothing is harder than changing one's own self. I understand this, for I have reshaped myself on more than one occasion. However, I will be here to hold your hand and help you through this transition. You need not take the journey alone. And you may console yourself with the knowledge that I will never lie to you. None of us shall, not within this room. Doubt me if you wish, but in time you will come to believe me. I consider this a hallowed place, and I would no more desecrate the idea it represents than cut off my own hand. You may ask whatever you want, and I promise you, Nisuda, daughter of a jihad, that we shall answer truthfully. As king of these lands, I give you my sworn word. She worked her jaw back and forth, trying to decide how to answer. Then, from between clenched teeth, she said, "I'll never tell you what you want to know." A slow, deep chuckle filled the room. "You misunderstand. I didn't have you brought here because I seek information. There's nothing you could say that I don't already know. The number and disposition of your troops, the state of your provisions, the locations of your supply trains, the manner in which you plan to lay siege to this citadel, Aragon and Saphira's duties, habits, and abilities, the Douth dart you acquired in Balatona, even the powers of the witch-child, Elva, whom you have kept by your side until but recently, all this I know, and more. Shall I quote the figures to you? No? Well then, my spies are more numerous and more highly placed than you imagine, and I have other means of gathering intelligence withal. You have no secrets from me, Nasuda, none whatsoever, therefore, it is pointless to insist upon holding your tongue." His words struck her like hammer blows, but she strove not to let them dishearten her. "Why, then? Why did I have you brought here? Because, my dear, you have the gift of command, and that is far deadlier than any spell. Aragon is no threat to me, nor are the elves, but you are dangerous in a way they are not. Without you, the Varden will be like a blinded bull. They will snort and rage, and they will charge straight ahead, heedless of what lies in their way. Then I will catch them and, with their folly, destroy them. But the destruction of the Varden is not the reason I had you abducted. No, you are here because you have proven yourself worthy of my attention. You are fierce, tenacious, ambitious, and intelligent, the very qualities I prize most in my servants. I wish to have you by my side, Nasuda, as my foremost advisor and as the general of my army as I move to implement the final stages of the great plan I have been laboring upon for nigh on a century. A new order is about to descend upon Algesia, and I would have you be a part of it. Ever since the last of the 13 died, I have searched for those who were fit to take their place. Until recently, my efforts have been in vain. Durza was a useful tool, but being a shade, he had certain limitations, a lack of concern for his own preservation to name but one. Of all the candidates I have examined, Murtaugh was the first I considered eligible and the first to survive the tests I set before him. You shall be the next, I am sure. And Aragon, the third." Horror crept through her as she listened to him. What he was proposing was far worse than she had envisioned. The maroon-clad man at the brazier startled her by shoving one of the iron rods into the coals with such force, the tip banged against the copper bowl underneath. Galbatorix continued speaking. "Should you live, you shall have a chance to accomplish more than you ever could with the Varden. Think of it. In my service, you could help bring peace to the whole of Algesia, and you would be my chief architect for accomplishing these changes. I would rather let 1,000 vipers bite me before I would agree to serve you," and she spat into the air. His chuckle echoed throughout the room once more, the sound of a man who feared nothing, not even death. "We shall see." She flinched as she felt a finger touch the inside of her elbow. It slowly traced a circle, then slid down to the first of her scars on her forearm and paused atop the ridge of flesh, warm against her skin. The finger tapped 3 times before proceeding to the next few scars, then back again, running over them like a washboard. "You have defeated an opponent in the trial of the long knives," said Galbatorix, "and with more cuts than any have endured in recent memory. That means both that you are exceptionally strong-willed and that you are able to suspend the functioning of your imagination, for it is an overactive imagination that turns men into cowards, not a surfeit of fear, as most believe. However, neither of these traits will be of help to you now. On the contrary, they are a hindrance. Everyone has a limit, whether physical or mental. The only question is how long it takes to reach that point. And you will reach it, I promise you. Your strength may delay the moment, but it cannot avert it. Nor will your wards avail you while you are within my power. Why, then, should you suffer needlessly? No one questions your courage, you have already demonstrated it to all the world. Give in now. There is no shame in accepting the inevitable. To continue would be to subject yourself to an array of torments for no other reason but to appease your sense of duty. Let your duty be appeased now, and give me your oath of fealty in the ancient language, and ere the hour is out, you will have 12 servants to command, robes of silk and damask to wear, a set of chambers to live in, and a place at my table when we dine." He paused then, waiting for her answer, but she stared at the lines painted on the ceiling and refused to speak. On her arm, the finger continued its exploration, moving from her scars to the hollow of her wrist, where it rested heavily upon a vein. "Very well. As you wish." The pressure on her wrist vanished. "Murtaugh, come, show yourself. You're being impolite to our guest." Ah, not him too, she thought, suddenly feeling a great sadness. At the brazier, the man in red slowly turned, and though he wore a silver mask over the upper half of his face, she saw it was indeed Murtaugh. His eyes were nearly lost in shadows, and his mouth and jaw were fixed in a grim expression. Murtaugh was somewhat reluctant when he first entered my service, but he has since proven to be a most apt student. He has his father's talents. Isn't that so? Yes, sir, said Murtaugh, his voice rough. He surprised me when he killed old King Hrothgar on the burning plains. I didn't expect him to turn on his former friends with such eagerness, but then, our Murtaugh is full of rage and bloodlust, he is. He would tear out the throat of a cull with his bare hands if I gave him the chance, and I have. Nothing pleases you so much as killing, now does it? The muscles in Murtaugh's neck tensed. No, sir. Galbatorix laughed softly. Murtaugh Kingkiller, 'tis a fine name, a name fit for a legend, but not one you should seek to earn again, except at my direction. Then to her. Until now I have neglected his instruction in the subtle arts of persuasion, which is why I brought him here with me today. He has some experience as the object of such arts, but never as the practitioner, and it is high time he learns to master them. And what better way to learn than here, with you? It was Murtaugh, after all, who convinced me that you were worthy of joining my newest generation of disciples. A strange sense of betrayal crept over her. Despite what had transpired, she had thought better of Murtaugh. She searched his face for an explanation, but he stood stiff as a guard on watch and kept his gaze averted. She could glean nothing from his expression. Then the king motioned toward the brazier and, in a conversational tone of voice, said, "Take up an iron." Murtaugh's hands curled into fists. Other than that, he did not move. A word rang in Nasuda's ears, like the clap of a great bell. The very warp and weft of the world seemed to vibrate at the sound, as if a giant had plucked the threads of reality and set them a-quivering. For a moment, she felt as if she were falling, and the air before her shimmered like water. Despite its power, she could not remember the letters that made up the word nor even what language it belonged to, for the word passed clean through her mind, leaving behind only the memory of its effects. Murtaugh shuddered. Then he twisted, grasped one of the iron rods, and pulled it from the brazier with a halting motion. Sparks sprayed into the air as the iron came free of the coals, and several glittering embers fell spiraling toward the floor like pine seeds from their cones. The end of the rod glowed a bright, pale yellow that, even as she watched, darkened to a ruddy orange. The light from the hot metal reflected off Murtaugh's polished half-mask, giving him a grotesque, inhuman appearance. She saw herself reflected in the mask as well, her form distorted into a crabbed torso with spindly legs that dwindled away into thin black lines along the curve of Murtaugh's cheek. Futile as it was, she could not help but pull against her restraints as he advanced toward her. "I don't understand," she said to Galbatorix with feigned calm. "Aren't you going to use your mind against me?" Not that she wanted him to, but she would rather defend herself from an attack on her consciousness than withstand the pain of the iron. "There will be time for that later, if need be," said Galbatorix. "For now, I am curious to discover how brave you really are, Nasuda, daughter of a jihad. Besides, I would prefer not to seize control of your mind and force you to swear fealty to me. Instead, I want you to make this decision of your own free will and while still in possession of your faculties." "Why?" she croaked. "Because it pleases me. Now, for the last time, will you submit?" "Never." "So be it, Murtaugh." The rod descended toward her, the tip like a giant, sparkling ruby. They had given her nothing to bite on, so she had no choice but to scream, and the eight-sided chamber reverberated with the sounds of her agony until her voice gave out and an all-consuming darkness enveloped her in its folds. On the wings of a dragon. Aragon lifted his head, took a deep breath, and felt a portion of his worries recede. Riding a dragon was far from restful, but being so close to Saphira was calming for both him and her. The simple pleasure of physical contact comforted them in a way few things did. Also, the constant sound and motion of her flight helped distract him from the black thoughts that had been dogging him. Despite the urgency of their trip and the precarious nature of their circumstances in general, Aragon was glad to be away from the Varden. The recent bloodshed had left him feeling as if he was no longer quite himself. Ever since he had rejoined the Varden at Feinster, he had spent the bulk of his time fighting or waiting to fight, and the strain was beginning to wear on him, especially after the violence and horror of Dras Leona. On the Varden's behalf, he had killed hundreds of soldiers, few of whom had stood even the slightest chance of harming him, and though his actions had been justified, the memories troubled him. He did not want every fight to be desperate and every opponent to be his equal or his better, far from it, but at the same time, the easy slaughter of so many made him feel more like a butcher than a warrior. Death, he had come to believe, was a corrosive thing, and the more he was around it, the more it gnawed away at who he was. However, being alone with Saphira, and Gladder, although the Golden Dragon had kept to himself since their departure, helped Aragon regain a sense of normalcy. He felt most comfortable alone or in small groups, and he preferred not to spend time in a town or a city or even a camp like the Vardens. Unlike the majority of people, he did not hate or fear the wilderness. As harsh as the empty lands were, they possessed a grace and a beauty that no artifice could compete with and that he found restorative. So he let Saphira's flying distract him, and for the better part of the day, he did nothing more important than watch the landscape slide past. From the Vardens' camp by the banks of Leona Lake, Saphira set out across the broad expanse of water, angling northwest and climbing so high that Aragon had to use a spell to shield himself from the cold. The lake appeared patchy, shining and sparkling in areas where the angle of the waves reflected the sunlight toward Saphira, dull and gray where it did not. Aragon never tired of staring at the constantly changing patterns of light. Nothing else in the world was quite like it. Fisher hawks, cranes, geese, ducks, starlings, and other birds often flew by underneath them. Most ignored Saphira, but a few of the hawks spiraled upward and accompanied her for a short while, seeming more curious than frightened. Two were even so bold as to swerve in front of her, mere feet from her long, sharp teeth. In many ways, the fierce, hook-clawed, yellow-beaked raptors reminded Aragon of Saphira herself, an observation that pleased her, for she admired the hawks as well, though not so much for their appearance as for their hunting prowess. The shore behind them gradually faded to a hazy purple line, then vanished altogether. For over half an hour, they saw only birds and clouds in the sky and the vast sheet of wind-hammered water that covered the surface of the earth. Then, ahead and to their left, the jagged gray outline of the spine began to appear along the horizon, a welcome sight to Aragon. Although these were not the mountains of his childhood, they still belonged to the same range, and seeing them, he felt not quite so far from his old home. The mountains grew in size until the stony, snow-capped peaks loomed before them like the broken battlements of a castle wall. Down their dark, green-covered flanks, dozens of white streams tumbled, wending their way through the creases in the land until they joined with the great lake that lay pressed against their foothills. A half-dozen villages sat upon the shore or close thereby, but on account of Aragon's magic, the people below remained oblivious to Saphira's presence as she sailed overhead. As he looked at the villages, it struck Aragon just how small and isolated they were and, in hindsight, how small and isolated Carvajal had been as well. Compared to the great cities he had visited, the villages were little more than clusters of hovels, barely fit for even the meanest of paupers. Many of the men and women within them, he knew, had never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace and would live their whole lives in a world bound by the limits of their sight. What a blinkered existence, he thought. And yet, he wondered if it was perhaps better to remain in one place and learn all you could about it rather than to constantly roam across the land. Was a broad but shallow education superior to one that was narrow but deep? He was not sure. He remembered Oromas once telling him that the whole of the world could be deduced from the smallest grain of sand, if one studied it closely enough. The spine was only a fraction of the height of the Bior Mountains, yet the slab-sided peaks still towered 1,000 feet or more above Saphira as she threaded her way between them, following the shadow-filled gorges and valleys that split the range. Now and then, she had to soar upward to clear a bare, snowy pass, and when she did and Aragon's range of view widened, he thought the mountains looked like so many molars erupting from the brown gums of the earth. As Saphira glided over a particularly deep valley, he saw at the bottom a glade with a ribbony stream wandering across the field of grass. And along the edges of the glade, he glimpsed what he thought might have been houses, or perhaps tents, it was hard to tell, hidden under the eaves of the heavy-boughed spruce trees that populated the flanks of the neighboring mountains. A single spot of firelight shone through a gap in the branches, like a tiny chip of gold embedded within the layers of black needles, and he thought he spied a lone figure lumbering away from the stream. The figure appeared strangely bulky, and its head seemed too large for its body. "I think that was an Urgal." "Where?" Saphira asked, and he sensed her curiosity. "In the clearing behind us." He shared the memory with her. "I wish we had the time to go back and find out. I'd like to see how they live." She snorted. Hot smoke streamed out of her nostrils, then rolled down her neck and over him. They might not take kindly to a dragon and rider landing among them without warning. He coughed and blinked as his eyes watered. "Do you mind?" She did not answer, but the line of smoke trailing from her nostrils ceased, and the air around him soon cleared. Not long afterward, the shape of the mountains began to look familiar to Aragon, and then a large rift opened up before Saphira and he realized they were flying across the pass that led to Tirm, the same pass he and Brahm had twice ridden through on horseback. It was much as he remembered it. The western branch of the Torque River still flowed fast and strong toward the distant sea, the surface of the water streaked with white mares' tails where boulders interrupted its course. The crude road he and Brahm had followed by the side of the river was still a pale, dusty line barely wider than a deer trail. He even thought he recognized a clump of trees where they had stopped to eat. Saphira turned westward and proceeded down the river until the mountains dropped away to lush, rain-soaked fields, whereupon she adjusted her course to a more northerly direction. Aragon did not question her decision. She never seemed to lose her bearing, not even on a starless night or when deep underground in Farthendur. The sun was close to the horizon when they flew out of the spine. As dusk settled over the land, Aragon occupied himself by trying to devise ways to trap, kill, or fool Galbatorix. After a time, Bladder emerged from his self-imposed isolation and joined him in his efforts. They spent an hour or so discussing various strategies, and then they practiced attacking and defending each other with their minds. Saphira participated in the exercise as well, but with limited success, as flying made it difficult for her to concentrate on anything else. Later, Aragon stared at the cold white stars for a while. Then he asked Bladder, could the Vault of Souls contain Eldenari that the riders hid from Galbatorix? No, said Bladder without hesitation. It's impossible. Oromis and I would have known if Vrail had sanctioned such a plan. And if any Eldenari had been left on Vroingard, we would have found them when we returned to search the island. It's not so easy to hide a living creature as you seem to think. Why not? If a hedgehog rolls into a ball, that doesn't mean that he becomes invisible, now does it? Minds are no different. You can shield your thoughts from others, but your existence is still apparent to anyone who searches the area. Surely with a spell you could. If a spell had tampered with our senses, we would have known, for we had wards to prevent that from happening. So, no Eldenari, Aragon concluded glumly. Unfortunately not. They flew on in silence as the waxing three-quarter moon rose above the jagged peaks of the spine. By its light, the land looked as if it were made out of pewter, and Aragon amused himself by imagining that it was an immense sculpture the dwarves had carved and stored within a cave as large as Algesia itself. Aragon could feel the pleasure Bladder took in their flight. Like Aragon and Saphira, the old dragon seemed to welcome the opportunity to leave behind their concerns on the ground, if even only for a short while, and to soar freely through the sky. It was Saphira who spoke next. Between the slow, heavy flaps of her wings, she said to Bladder, tell us a story, Ebrithel. What manner of story would you hear? The tale of how you and Oromis were captured by the Forsworn, and how you then escaped. At this, Aragon's interest increased. He had always been curious about the matter himself, but he had never worked up the courage to ask Oromis. Bladder was quiet for a span, then said, when Galbatorix and Morzin returned from the wilds and began their campaign against our order, we did not at first realize the severity of the threat. We were concerned, of course, but no more than if we had discovered that a shade was stalking the land. Galbatorix was not the first rider to go mad, although he was the first to have acquired a disciple such as Morzin. That alone should have warned us of the danger we faced, but the truth was only apparent in hindsight. At the time, we failed to consider that Galbatorix might have gathered other followers or that he would even attempt such a thing. It seemed absurd that any of our brethren could prove susceptible to Galbatorix's poisonous whisperings. Morzin was still a novice, his weakness was understandable. But those who were already riders in full, we never questioned their loyalties. For only when they were tempted did they reveal the extent to which their spite and weaknesses had corrupted them. Some wanted revenge for old hurts. Others believed that, by virtue of our power, dragons and riders deserved to rule over the whole of Algesia, and others, I am afraid to say, simply enjoyed the chance to tear down what was and indulge themselves however they wanted. The old dragon paused, and Aragon sensed ancient hates and sorrows shading his mind. Then Bladder continued. Events at that point were confusing. Little was known, and what reports we received were so larded with rumors and speculation as to be useless. Oromis and I began to suspect that something far worse was afoot than most realized. We tried to convince several of the older dragons and riders, but they disagreed and dismissed our concerns. Fools they were not, but centuries of peace had clouded their vision, and they were unable to see that the world was shifting around us. Frustrated with the lack of information, Oromis and I left Illyria to discover what we could for ourselves. We brought 2 younger riders with us, both elves and accomplished warriors, who had recently returned from scouting the northern reaches of the Spine. It was partly at their urging that we ventured forth on our expedition. Their names you might recognize, for they were Keolandi and Formora. Ah, said Aragon, suddenly understanding. Yes. After a day and a half of traveling, we stopped at Edernarage, a watchtower built of old to stand guard over Silverwood Forest. Unbeknownst to us, Keolandi and Formora had visited the tower beforehand and slain the 3 elven rangers stationed there. Then they had placed a trap upon the stones that ringed the tower, a trap that caught us the moment my claws touched the grass upon the knoll. It was a clever spell, Galbatorix had taught it to them himself. We had no defense against it, for it caused us no harm, only held us and slowed us, like honey poured over our bodies and minds. While we were thus snared, minutes passed as seconds. Keolandi, Formora, and their dragons flitted around us faster than hummingbirds. They appeared as no more than dark blurs at the edges of our vision. When they were ready, they released us. They had cast dozens of spells, spells to bind us in place, spells to blind us, and spells to prevent Oromis from speaking, so as to make it more difficult for him to cast spells. Again, their magic did not hurt us, and thus we had no defense against it. The moment we could, we attacked Keolandi, Formora, and their dragons with our minds, and they us, and for hours thereafter, we strove against them. The experience was not pleasant. They were weaker and less skilled than Oromis and I, but there were 2 of them for each of us, and they had with them the heart of hearts of a dragon named Agaravel, whose rider they had slain, and her strength added to their own. As a result, we were hard-pressed to defend ourselves. Their intent, we discovered, was to force us to help Galbatorix and the Forsworn enter Illyria unnoticed, so that they might catch the riders by surprise and capture the Eldenari who were then living in the city. How did you escape? Asked Aragon. In time, it became clear that we would not be able to defeat them. So, Oromis decided to risk using magic in an attempt to free us, even though he knew it would provoke Keolandi and Formora into attacking us with magic in return. It was a desperate ploy, but it was the only choice we had. At a certain point, without knowing of Oromis's plans, I struck back at our attackers, seeking to hurt them. Oromis had been waiting for just such a moment. He had long known the rider who had instructed Keolandi and Formora in the ways of magic, and he was well familiar with Galbatorix's twisted reasoning. From that knowledge, he was able to guess at how Keolandi and Formora had worded their spells, and where the flaws in their enchantments were likely to lie. Oromis had only seconds to act. The moment he began to use magic, Keolandi and Formora realized what he was about, panicked, and began to cast their own spells. It took Oromis 3 tries to break our bonds. How exactly he did it, I cannot say. I doubt whether he really understood it himself. Most simply, he shifted us a finger's breadth away from where we had been standing. Like how Arya sent my egg from Due Weldenbarden to the Spine? Asked Saphira. Yes, and no, Gladder replied. Yes, he transported us from one place to another without moving us through the intervening space. But he did not just shift our position, he also shifted the very substance of our flesh, rearranged it so that we were no longer what we once were. Many of the smallest parts of our bodies can be exchanged for one another without ill effect, and so he did with every muscle, bone, and organ. Aragon frowned. Such a spell was a feat of the highest order, a wonder of magical dexterity that few in history could have hoped to carry out. Still, as impressed as Aragon was, he could not help but ask, how could that have worked, though? You would still be the same person as before. You would, and yet you would not. The difference between who we had been and who we then were was slight, but it was enough to render useless the enchantments Keolandi and Formora had woven about us. What of the spells they cast once they noticed what Oromis was doing? Asked Saphira. An image came to Aragon of Gladder ruffling his wings, as if he were tired of sitting in one position for so long. The first spell, Formora's, was meant to kill us, but our wards stopped it. The second, which was from Keolandi, that was a different matter. It was a spell Keolandi had learned from Galbatorix, and he from the spirits who possessed Durza. This I know, for I was in contact with Keolandi's mind even when he wrought his enchantment. It was a clever, fiendish spell, the purpose of which was to prevent Oromas from touching and manipulating the flow of energy around him, and thereby to prevent him from using magic. Did Kialandi do the same to you? He would have, but he feared it would either kill me or sever my connection with my heart of hearts and thus create two independent versions of me that they would then have to subdue. Even more than elves, dragons depend on magic for our existence. Without it, we would soon die. Aragon could sense Saphira's curiosity was aroused. Has that ever happened? Has the connection between a dragon and the dragon's Eldenari ever been severed while the dragon's body was still alive? It has, but that is a tale for another time. Saphira subsided, but Aragon could tell that she intended to raise the question again at the soonest opportunity. But Kialandi's spell didn't stop Oromas from being able to use magic, did it? Not entirely. It was supposed to, but Kialandi cast the spell even as Oromas shifted us from place to place, and so its effect was somewhat lessened. Still, it kept him from working all but the smallest of magics, and as you know, the spell remained with him for the rest of his life, despite the efforts of our wisest healers. Why didn't his wards protect him? Bladder seemed to sigh. That is a mystery. No one had done such a thing before, Aragon, and of those still living, only Galbatorix now knows the secret of it. The spell was bound to Oromas's mind, but it may not have affected him directly. Instead, it may have worked upon the energy around him or upon his link to the same. The elves have long studied magic, but even they do not fully understand how the material and immaterial worlds interact. It is a riddle that will likely never be solved. However, it seems reasonable to assume that the spirits know more than we about both the material and the immaterial, considering that they are the embodiment of the second and that they occupy the first when in the form of a shade. Whatever the truth may be, the outcome was this. Oromas cast his spell, and he freed us, but the effort was too much for him, and a fit came over him, the first of many. Never again was he able to cast such a powerful spell, and ever after, he suffered a weakness of the flesh that would have killed him if not for his skill with magic. The weakness was already in him when Kialandi and Formora captured us, but when he shifted us and reshuffled the parts of our bodies, he brought it to the fore. Otherwise, the malady might have lain dormant for many more years. Oromas fell to the ground, as helpless as a hatchling, even as Formora and her dragon, an ugly brown thing, ran at us, the others close behind. I leapt over Oromas, and I attacked. If they had realized he was crippled, they would have taken advantage of his condition to slip into his mind and make it their own. I had to distract them until Oromas recovered. I have never fought harder than I did that day. There were 4 of them arrayed against me, 5 if you include a Garabel in the tally. Both of my kin, the brown and Kialandi's purple, were smaller than me, but their teeth were sharp and their claws were fast. Still, my rage gave me a strength greater than normal, and I dealt grave wounds to them both. Kialandi was foolish enough to come within my reach, and I grasped him with my talons and threw him at his own dragon. Bladder made a sound of amusement. His magic did not protect him against that. One of the spikes on the purple's back impaled him, and I might have killed him then and there had not the brown forced me to retreat. We must have fought for almost 5 minutes before I heard Oromas shout that we must flee. I kicked up dirt in the faces of my enemies, then returned to Oromas and grasped him in my right forepaw and took flight from Edernarich. Kialandi and his dragon could not follow, but Formora and the brown could and did. They caught us less than a mile from the watchtower. We closed several times, and then the brown flew underneath me, and I saw Formora about to strike at my right leg with her sword. She was trying to force me to drop Oromas, I think, or perhaps she wanted to kill him. I twisted to evade the blow, and instead of my right leg, her sword struck my left, cutting it off. The memory that passed through Gladder's mind was that of a hard, cold, pinching sensation, as if Formora's blade had been forged of ice, not steel. The feeling made Aragon queasy. He swallowed and tightened his grip on the front of the saddle, grateful that Saphira was safe. It hurt less than you might imagine, but I knew that I could not continue to fight, so I turned and raced toward Illyria as fast as my wings could carry me. In a way, Formora's victory worked against her, for without the burden of my leg, I was able to outdistance the brown and thus escape. Oromas was able to stop the bleeding, but no more, and he was too weak to contact Rael or the other Elder Riders and warn them of Galbatorix's plans. Once Kialandi and Formora reported to him, we knew that Galbatorix would attack Illyria soon thereafter. If he waited, it would only give us time to fortify, and strong as he was, surprise was still Galbatorix's greatest weapon in those days. When we arrived at Illyria, we were dismayed to find that few of our order were still there. In our absence, more had left to search for Galbatorix or to consult with Vrail in person on Vroingard. We convinced those who remained of the danger, and we had them warn Vrail and the other elder dragons and riders. They were loath to believe that Galbatorix had the forces needed to attack Illyria, or that he would dare do such a thing. But in the end, we were able to make them see the truth of the matter. As a result, they decided that all of the Eldenari and Elegesia should be taken to Vroingard for safekeeping. It seemed a prudent measure, but we should have sent them to Elsmera instead. If nothing else, we should have left the Eldenari that were already in Due Weldenbarden where they were. At least then some of them would have remained free of Galbatorix. Alas, none of us thought that they would be safer among the elves than on Vroingard, at the very center of our order. Vrail ordered every dragon and rider who was within a few days' journey of Illyria to hurry to the aid of the city, but Oromus and I feared they would be too late. Nor were we in any state to help defend Illyria. So we gathered what supplies we needed, and with our 2 remaining students, Brahm and the dragon who is your namesake, Saphira, we left the city that very night. You have seen, I think, the Fairth Oromus made as we departed. Aragon nodded absently as he remembered the image of the beautiful, tower-filled city clustered about the base of an escarpment and lit by a rising harvest moon. And that is how it came to be that we were not in Illyria when Galbatorix and the Forsworn attacked a few hours later. And it is also why we were not at Vroingard when the Oathbreakers defeated the combined might of all our forces and sacked Doru Araeba. From Illyria, we went to Due Weldenbarden in the hope that the elven healers might be able to cure Oromus's ailment and restore his ability to use magic. When they could not, we decided to remain where we were, for it seemed safer than flying all the way to Vroingard when both of us were hampered by our injuries and we might be ambushed at any point along the journey. Brahm and Saphira did not stay with us, though. Despite our advice to the contrary, they went to join the fight, and it was in that fighting that your namesake died, Saphira. And now you know how the Forsworn captured us and how we escaped. After a moment, Saphira said, "Thank you for the story, Ibrithel. You are welcome, Bjartskuller, but never ask it of me again." When the moon was nearing its zenith, Aragon saw a nest of dim orange lights floating in the darkness. It took him a moment to realize they were the torches and lanterns of Tyrm, many miles away. And, high above the other lights, a bright yellow spot appeared for a second, like a great eye glaring at him. Then it vanished and reappeared, flashing on and off in a never-changing cycle, as if the eye were blinking. "The lighthouse at Tyrm is lit," he said to both Saphira and Gladder. "Then a storm is brewing," said Gladder. Saphira's flapping ceased, and Aragon felt her tip forward and begin a long, slow glide toward the ground. A half-hour elapsed before she landed. By then, Tyrm was a faint glow to the south, and the beam from the lighthouse was no brighter than a star. Saphira lit on an empty beach strewn with twisted driftwood. By the light of the moon, the hard, flat strand appeared almost white, while the waves that crashed into it were gray and black and seemed angry, as if the ocean were trying to devour the land with each breaker it sent forth. Aragon unbuckled the straps around his legs, then slid off Saphira, grateful for the opportunity to stretch his muscles. He noted the smell of brine as he sprinted down the strand toward a large chunk of driftwood, his cloak flapping behind him. At the piece of wood, he spun around and sprinted back to Saphira. She sat where he had left her, staring out to sea. He paused, wondering if she was going to speak, for he could feel a great strain within her, but when she remained silent, he turned on his heel and again sprinted to the driftwood. She would talk when she was ready. Back and forth Aragon ran, until he was warm all over and his legs felt wobbly. And yet the whole time Saphira kept her gaze fixed on some point in the distance. As Aragon threw himself down on a patch of sedge next to her, Gladder said, "It would be foolish to try." Aragon cocked his head, unsure to whom the dragon was speaking. "I know I can do it," said Saphira. "You have never before been to Vroingard," said Gladder. "And if there is a storm, it might drive you far out to sea, or worse. More than one dragon has perished because of overweening confidence. The wind is not your friend, Saphira. It can help you, but it can also destroy you. I am not a hatchling to be instructed about the wind. No, but you are still young, and I do not think you are ready for this. The other way would take too long. Perhaps, but better to get there safely than not at all." "What are you talking about?" Aragon asked. The sand under Saphira's front feet made a gritty, rustling sound as she flexed her claws, sinking them deep into the earth. We have a choice to make, said Gladder. From here, Saphira can either fly straight to Vroingard or follow the coastline north until she reaches the point on the mainland closest to the island and then, only then, turn west and cross the sea. Which path would be faster? Aragon asked, although he had already guessed the answer. Flying straight there, said Saphira. But if she does, then she would be over the water the whole time. Saphira bristled. It's no farther than it was from the Varden to here. Or am I wrong? You're more tired now, and if there is a storm, then I'll fly around it, she said, and huffed, releasing a spike of blue and yellow flame from her nostrils. The flame branded itself into Aragon's vision, leaving behind a flashing afterimage. Ah, now I can't see. He rubbed his eyes as he tried to help the afterimage fade away. Would flying straight there really be all that dangerous? It could be, rumbled Gladder. How much longer would it take to go along the coastline? Half a day, maybe a bit more. Aragon scratched the stubble on his chin as he stared at the forbidding mass of water. Then he looked up at Saphira and, in a low voice, said, "Are you sure you can do this?" She twisted her neck and returned his gaze with one huge eye. Her pupil had expanded until it was nearly circular. It was so large and black, Aragon felt as if he could crawl into it and disappear altogether. "As sure as I can be," she said. He nodded and ran his hands through his hair as he accustomed himself to the idea. "Then we have to chance it. Gladder, if need be, you can guide her? You can help her?" The old dragon was quiet for a while, then he surprised Aragon by humming in his mind, even as Saphira hummed when she was pleased or amused. "Very well. If we are to tempt fate, then let us not be cowards about it. Across the sea it is." The matter settled, Aragon climbed back onto Saphira, and with a single bound, she left behind the safety of solid land and took flight over the trackless waves. The sound of his voice. The touch of his hand. "Badge. Will you swear your fealty to me in the ancient language?" "Never." His question and her answer had become a ritual between them, a call and response such as children might use in a game, except that in this game she lost even when she won. Rituals were all that allowed Nasuda to maintain her sanity. By them, she ordered her world, by them, she was able to endure from one moment to the next, for they gave her something to hold on to when all else had been stripped from her. Rituals of thought, rituals of action, rituals of pain and relief. These had become the framework upon which her life depended. Without them, she would have been lost, a sheep without a shepherd, a devotee bereft of faith, a rider separated from her dragon. Unfortunately, this particular ritual always ended in the same way, with another touch of the iron. She screamed and bit her tongue, and blood filled her mouth. She coughed, trying to clear her throat, but there was too much blood and she began to choke. Her lungs burned from a lack of air, and the lines on the ceiling wavered and grew dim, and then her memory ceased and there was nothing, not even darkness. Afterward, Galbatorix spoke to her while the irons heated. This too had become one of their rituals. He had healed her tongue, at least, she thought it had been him and not Murtaugh, for as he said, "It wouldn't do if you were unable to speak, now would it? How else will I know when you are ready to serve me?" As before, the king sat to her right, at the very edge of her vision, where all she could see of him was a gold-edged shadow, his form partially hidden beneath the long, heavy cape he wore. "I met your father, you know, when he was steward of Induriel's chief estate," said Galbatorix. "Did he tell you of that?" She shuddered and closed her eyes and felt tears seep from the corners. She hated listening to him. His voice was too powerful, too seductive. It left her wanting to do whatever he desired just so she could hear him utter a tiny morsel of praise. "Yes," she murmured. "I took little notice of him at the time. Why would I? He was a servant, no one of significance. Induriel allowed him a fair bit of freedom, the better to manage the affairs of the estate, too much freedom, as it turned out." The king made a dismissive gesture, and the light caught his lean, claw-like hand. Induriel always was overly permissive. It was his dragon who was the cunning one. Induriel merely did as he was told. What a strange, amusing series of events fate has arranged. To think, the man who saw to it that my boots were brightly polished went on to become my foremost enemy after Brahm, and now here you are, his daughter, returned to Urubayan and about to enter my service, even as did your father. How very ironic, would you not agree? My father escaped, and he nearly killed Durza when he did, she said. All your spells and oaths could not hold him any more than you'll be able to hold me. She thought Galbatorix might have frowned. Yes, that was unfortunate. Durza was quite put out about it at the time. Families seem to make it easier for people to change who they are and thus their true names, which is why I now choose my household servants only from those who are barren and unwed. However, you are sorely mistaken if you think to slip your bonds. The only ways to leave the hall of the soothsayer are by swearing loyalty to me or by dying. Then I will die. How very short-sighted. The gilded shadow of the king leaned toward her. Have you never entertained the thought, Nisuda, that the world would have been worse off had I not overthrown the riders? The riders kept the peace, she said. They protected the whole of Algesia from war, from plague, from the threat of shades. In times of famine, they brought food to the starving. How is this land a better place without them? Because there was a price attached to their service. You of all people should know that everything in this world must be paid for, whether in gold, time, or blood. Nothing is without its price, not even the riders. Especially not the riders. Aye, they kept the peace, but they also stifled the races of this land, the elves and dwarves just as much as humans. What is always said in praise of the riders when the bards bemoan their passing? That their reign extended for thousands of years, and that during this much vaunted, golden age, little changed besides the names of the kings and queens who sat smug and secure upon their thrones. Oh, there were little alarms. A shade here, an incursion by Urgles there, a skirmish between two dwarf clans over a mine no one but they cared about. But on the whole, the order of things remained exactly the same as it had been when the riders first rose to prominence. She heard the clink of metal against metal as Murtaugh stirred the coals in the brazier. She wished she could see his face so that she could gauge his reaction to Galbatorix's words, but as was his habit, he stood with his back to her, staring down at the coals. The only time he looked at her was when he had to apply the white-hot metal to her flesh. That was his particular ritual, and she suspected he needed it as much as she needed hers. And still Galbatorix kept talking. Does that not seem the most evil thing to you, Nisuda? Life is change, and yet the riders suppressed it so that the land lay in an uneasy slumber, unable to shake off the chains that bound it, unable to advance or retreat as nature intended, unable to become something new. I saw with my own eyes scrolls in the vaults at Vroingard and here, in the vaults of Illyria, that detailed discoveries, magical, mechanical, and from every sphere of natural philosophy. Discoveries that the writers kept hidden because they feared what might happen if those things became generally known. The writers were cowards wedded to an old way of life and an old way of thinking, determined to defend it unto their dying breath. Theirs was a gentle tyranny, but a tyranny nevertheless. Were murder and betrayal really the solution, though, she asked, not caring if he punished her for it. He laughed, seeming genuinely amused. Such hypocrisy. You condemn me for the very thing you seek to do. If you could, you would kill me where I sit, and with no more hesitation than were I a rabid dog. You're a traitor, I'm not. I am the victor. In the end, nothing else matters. We are not so different as you think, Nisuda. You wish to kill me because you believe my death would be an improvement for Algesia, and because you, who are still almost a child, believe you can do a better job of ruling the empire than I. Your arrogance would cause others to despise you. But not me, for I understand. I took up arms against the riders for those very same reasons, and I was right to do so. Did vengeance have nothing to do with it? She thought he smiled. It might have provided the initial inspiration, but neither hate nor revenge was my guiding motive. I was concerned by what the riders had become and convinced, as I still am, that only when they were gone could we flourish as a race. For a moment, the pain from her wounds made it impossible for her to talk. Then she managed to whisper, "If what you say is true, and I have no cause to believe you, but if it is, then you are no better than the riders. You pillaged their libraries and gathered up their stores of knowledge, and as of yet, you have shared none of that lore with anyone else." He moved nearer to her, and she felt his breath upon her ear. "That is because, scattered throughout their hoard of secrets, I found hints of a greater truth, a truth that could provide an answer to one of the most perplexing questions in history." A shiver ran down her spine. What question? He leaned back in his chair and tugged at the edge of his cape. The question of how a king or a queen can enforce the laws they enact when there are those among their subjects who can use magic. When I realized what the hints alluded to, I put aside all else and committed myself to hunting down this truth, this answer, for I knew it was of paramount importance. That is why I have kept the writer's secrets to myself. I have been busy with my search. The answer to this problem must be set into place before I make known any of those other discoveries. The world is already a troubled place, and it is better to soothe the waters before disturbing them once more. It took took me nearly 100 years to find the information I needed, and now that I have, I shall use it to reshape the whole of Algesia. Magic is the great injustice in the world. It would not be so unfair if the ability only occurred among those who were weak, for then it would be a compensation for what chance or circumstance had robbed them of, but it doesn't. The strong are just as likely to be able to use magic, and they gain more from it besides. One need only look to the elves to see this is true. The problem is not confined to individuals, it also plagues the relationships between the races. The elves find it easier than us to maintain order within their society, for most every elf can use magic, and, therefore, few of them are ever at the mercy of another. In this regard, they are fortunate, but it is not so fortunate for us, for the dwarves, or even for the accursed Urgles. We have only been able to live here in Algesia because the elves permitted it. If they wanted, they could have swept us from the face of the earth as easily as a flood might sweep away an anthill. But no more, not while I am here to oppose their might. The riders would never have let them kill us or drive us away. No, but while the riders existed, we were dependent upon their goodwill, and it is not right that we should have to rely on others for our safekeeping. The riders began as a means to keep the peace between elves and dragons, but in the end, their main purpose became upholding the rule of law throughout the land. They were, however, insufficient to the task, as are my own spellcasters, the Black Hand. The problem is too far-reaching for any one group to combat. My own life is proof enough of that. Even if there were a trustworthy band of spellcasters adept enough to watch over all the other magicians in Algesia, ready to intervene at the slightest hint of malfeasance, we would still be reliant upon the very ones whose powers we sought to restrain. Ultimately, the land would be no safer than it is now. No, in order to solve this problem, it must be addressed on a deeper, more fundamental level. The ancients knew how that might be done, and now so do I. Galbatorix shifted in the chair, and she caught a sharp gleam from his eye, as from a lantern set deep within a cave. I shall make it so that no magician will be able to harm another person, whether human, dwarf, or elf. None shall be able to cast a spell unless they have permission, and only magics that are benign and beneficial shall be allowed. Even the elves will be bound by this precept, and they shall learn to measure their words carefully or speak not at all. And who will grant permission? She asked. Who will decide what is allowed and what is not? You? Someone must. It was I who recognized what was needed, I who discovered the means, and I who shall implement them. You sneer at the thought? Well then, ask yourself this, Nasuda, have I been a bad king? Be honest now. By the standards of my forebears, I have not been excessive. You have been cruel. That is not the same thing. You have led the Varden, you understand the burdens of command. Surely you have realized the threat that magic poses to the stability of any kingdom? To give but one example, I have spent more time laboring over the enchantments that protect the coin of the realm from being forged than I have upon most any other aspect of my duties. And yet, no doubt, there is a clever-minded conjurer somewhere who has found a way to circumvent my wards and who is busy making bags of lead coins with which he can fool nobles and commoners alike. Why else do you think I have been so careful to restrict the use of magic throughout the empire? Because it is a threat to you. No, there you are exactly wrong. It is no threat to me. No one and nothing is. However, spellcasters are a threat to the proper functioning of this realm, and that I shall not tolerate. Once I have bound every magician in the world to the laws of the land, imagine the peace and prosperity that shall reign. No more shall men or dwarves have to fear elves. No more shall riders be able to impose their will on others. No more shall those who cannot use magic be prey for those who can. Algesia will be transformed, and with our newfound safety, we will build a more wondrous tomorrow, one you could be a part of. Enter into my service, Nasuda, and you will have the opportunity to oversee the creation of a world such as has never existed before. A world where a man will stand or fall based upon the strength of his limbs and the keenness of his mind, and not whether chance has granted him skill with magic. Man may build up his limbs and man may improve his mind, but never can he learn to use magic if he was born lacking the ability. As I said, magic is the great injustice, and for the good of all, I will impose limits upon every magician there is. She stared at the lines on the ceiling and tried to ignore him. So much of what he said was similar to what she had thought herself. He was right. Magic was the most destructive force in the world, and if it could be regulated, Algesia would be a better place for it. She hated that there had been nothing to stop Aragon from. Blue, red, patterns of interwoven color, the throbbing of her burns. She strove desperately to concentrate upon anything other than nothing. Whatever she had been about to think of was nothing, did not exist. You call me evil. You curse my name and seek to overthrow me. But remember this, Nasuda. It was not I who started this war, and I am not responsible for those who have lost their lives as a result. I did not seek this out. You did. I would have been content to devote myself to my studies, but the Varden insisted upon stealing Saphira's egg from my treasure house, and you and your kind are responsible for all of the blood and sorrow that have followed. You are the ones, after all, who have been rampaging across the countryside, burning and pillaging as you please, not I. And yet you have the audacity to claim that I am in the wrong. Were you to go into the homes of the peasants, they would tell you that it is the Varden they fear most. They would talk about how they look to my soldiers for protection and how they hope the Empire will defeat the Varden and all shall be as it was. Nasuda wet her lips. Even though she knew her boldness might cost her, she said, "It seems to me you protest too much. If the welfare of your subjects were your main concern, you would have flown out to confront the Varden weeks ago, instead of letting an army roam loose within your borders. That is, unless you are not so sure of your might as you pretend. Or is it you fear the elves will take Urubayan while you are gone?" As had become her habit, she spoke of the Varden as if she knew no more about them than any random person in the Empire. Galbatorix shifted, and she could tell he was about to respond, but she was not yet finished. "And what of the Urgles? You cannot convince me your cause is just when you would exterminate an entire race in order to ease your pain at the death of your first dragon. Have you no answer for that, Oathbreaker? Speak to me of the dragons, then. Explain why you slew so many that you doomed their kind to a slow and inevitable extinction. And finally, explain your mistreatment of the Eldenari you captured." In her anger, she allowed herself that one slip. "You have bent and broken them and chained them to your will. There is no rightness in what you do, only selfishness and a never-ending hunger for power." Galbatorix regarded her in silence for a long, uncomfortable while. Then she saw his outline move as he crossed his arms. "I think the irons ought to be sufficiently hot by now. Murtaugh, if you would." She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her skin, and her muscles began to tremble, despite her best efforts to hold them still. One of the iron rods scraped against the lip of the brazier as Murtaugh pulled it free. He turned to face her, and she could not help but stare at the tip of the glowing metal. Then she looked into Murtaugh's eyes, and she saw the guilt and self-loathing they contained, and a sense of profound sorrow overcame her. "What fools we are," she thought. "What sorry, miserable fools." After that, she had no more energy for thinking, and so she fell back to her well-worn rituals, clinging to them for survival even as a drowning man might cling to a piece of wood. When Murtaugh and Galbatorix departed, she was in too much pain to do more than gaze mindlessly at the patterns on the ceiling while she struggled not to cry. She was sweating and shivering at the same time, as if she had a fever, and she found it impossible to concentrate upon any one thing for more than a few seconds. The pain from her burns did not subside as it would have if she had been cut or bruised. Indeed, the throbbing from her wounds seemed to grow worse with time. She closed her eyes and concentrated upon slowing her breathing as she tried to calm her body. The first time Galbatorix and Murtaugh had visited her, she had been far more courageous. She had cursed and taunted them and done all she could to hurt them with her words. However, through Murtaugh, Galbatorix had made her suffer for her insolence, and she had soon lost her taste for open rebellion. The iron made her timid, even the memory of it made her want to curl into a tight little ball. During their second, most recent visit, she had said as little as possible until her final, imprudent outburst. She had tried to test Galbatorix's claim that neither he nor Murtaugh would lie to her. She did this by asking them questions about the Empire's inner workings, facts that her spies had informed her of but that Galbatorix had no reason to believe she knew. So far as she could determine, Galbatorix and Murtaugh had told her the truth, but she was not about to trust anything the king said when there was no way to verify his claims. As for Murtaugh, she was not quite so sure. When he was with the king, she gave no credence to his words, but when he was by himself. Several hours after her first, agonizing audience with King Galbatorix, when she had at long last fallen into a shallow, troubled sleep, Murtaugh had come alone to the hall of the soothsayer, bleary-eyed and smelling of drink. He had stood by the monolith upon which she lay, and he had stared at her with such a strange, tormented expression, she had not been sure what he was going to do. At last he had turned away, walked to the nearest wall, and slid down it to the floor. There he sat, with his knees pulled up against his chest, his long, shaggy hair obscuring most of his face, and blood oozing from the torn skin on the knuckles of his right hand. After what felt like minutes, he had reached into his maroon jerkin, for he was wearing the same clothes as earlier, although without the mask, and drawn forth a small stone bottle. He drank several times and then began to talk. He talked, and she listened. She had no choice, but she did not allow herself to believe what he said. Not at first. For all she knew, everything he said or did was a sham designed to win her confidence. Murtaugh had started by telling her a rather garbled story about a man named Tornak, which involved a riding mishap and some sort of advice Tornak had given him regarding how an honorable man ought to live. She had been unable to make out whether Tornak was a friend, a servant, a distant relative, or some combination thereof, but whatever he was, it was obvious that he had meant a great deal to Murtaugh. When he concluded his story, Murtaugh had said, "Galbatorix was going to have you killed. He knew Elva wasn't guarding you as she used to, so he decided it was the perfect time to have you assassinated. I only found out about his plan by chance. I happened to be with him when he gave the orders to the Black Hand." Murtaugh shook his head. "It's my fault. I convinced him to have you brought here instead. He liked that. He knew you would lure Aragon here that much faster. It was the only way I could keep him from killing you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." And he buried his head in his arms. "I would rather have died." "I know," he said in a hoarse voice. "Will you forgive me?" That she had not answered. His revelation only made her more uneasy. Why should he care to save her life, and what did he expect in return? Murtaugh had said nothing more for a while. Then, sometimes weeping and sometimes raging, he told her of his upbringing in Galbatorix's court, of the distrust and jealousy he had faced as the son of Morzin, of the nobles who had sought to use him to win favor with the king, and of his longing for the mother he barely remembered. Twice he mentioned Aragon and cursed him for a fool favored by fortune. He would not have done so well if our places had been reversed. But our mother chose to take him to Carvajal, not me. He spat on the floor. She found the whole episode maudlin and self-pitying, and his weakness did nothing but inspire contempt in her until he recounted how the twins had abducted him from Farthendur, how they had mistreated him on the way to Urubayan, and how Galbatorix had broken him once they arrived. Some of the tortures he described were worse than her own and, if true, gave her a slight measure of sympathy for his own plight. "Thorn was my undoing," Murtaugh finally confessed. "When he hatched for me and we bonded, he shook his head. I love him. How could I not? I love him even as Aragon loves Saphira. The moment I touched him, I was lost. Galbatorix used him against me. Thorn was stronger than me. He never gave up, but I could not bear to see him suffer, so I swore my loyalty to the king, and after that," Murtaugh's lips curled with revulsion. "After that, Galbatorix went into my mind. He learned everything about me, and then he taught me my true name. And now I am his. His forever." Then he leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes, and she watched the tears roll down his cheeks. Eventually, he stood, and as he walked toward the door, he paused next to her and touched her on the shoulder. His nails, she noted, were clean and trimmed, but nowhere near as well cared for as her jailer's. He murmured a few words in the ancient language, and a moment later, her pain melted away, although her wounds looked the same as ever. As he took his hand away, she said, "I cannot forgive, but I understand." Whereupon he nodded and stumbled away, leaving her to wonder if she had found a new ally. Small rebellions. As Nasuda lay on the slab, sweating and shivering, every part of her body aching with pain, she found herself wishing that Murtaugh would return, if only so he could again free her from her agony. When at last the door to the 8-sided chamber swung open, she was unable to suppress her relief, but her relief turned to bitter disappointment when she heard the shuffling footsteps of her jailer descending the stairs that led into the room. As he had once before, the stocky, narrow-shouldered man bathed her wounds with a wet cloth, then bound them with strips of linen. When he released her from the restraints so that she could visit the privy room, she found she was too weak to make any attempt to grab the knife on the tray of food. Instead, she contented herself with thanking the man for his help and, for the second time, complimenting him on his nails, which were even shinier than before and which he quite obviously wanted her to see, for he kept holding his hands where she could not help but look at them. After he fed her and departed, she tried to sleep, but the constant pain of her wounds made it impossible for her to do more than doze. Her eyes snapped open as she heard the bar to the door of the chamber being thrown open. Not again, she thought, panic welling up inside her. Not so soon. I can't bear it. I'm not strong enough. Then she reined in her fear and told herself, Don't say such things or else you'll start to believe them. Still, although she was able to master her conscious reactions, she could not stop her heart from pounding at twice its normal speed. A single pair of footsteps echoed in the room, and then Murtaugh appeared at the corner of her vision. He wore no mask, and his expression was somber. This time he healed her first, without waiting. The relief she felt as her pain abated was so intense, it bordered on ecstasy. In all her life, she had never experienced a sensation quite so pleasurable as the draining away of the agony. She gasped slightly at the feeling. Thank you. Murtaugh nodded. Then he went over to the wall and sat in the same spot as before. She studied him for a minute. The skin on his knuckles was smooth and whole again, and he appeared sober, if grim and close-mouthed. His clothes had once been fine, but they were now torn, frayed, and patched, and she spotted what looked like several cuts in the undersides of his sleeves. She wondered if he had been fighting. Does Galbatorix know where you are? She finally asked. He might, but I doubt it. He's busy playing with his favorite concubines. That, or he's asleep. It's the middle of the night right now. Besides, I cast a spell to keep anyone from listening to us. He could break it if he wants, but I would know. What if he finds out? Murtaugh shrugged. He will find out, you know, if he wears down my defenses. Then don't let him. You're stronger than me, you have no one he can threaten. You can resist him, unlike me. The Varden are fast approaching, as are the elves from the north. If you can hold out for another few days, there's a chance maybe they can free you. You don't believe they can, do you? He shrugged again. Then help me escape. A bark of hard laughter erupted from his throat. How? I can't do much more than put on my boots without Galbatorix's permission. You could loosen my cuffs, and when you leave, perhaps you could forget to secure the door. His upper lip curled in a sneer. There are 2 men stationed outside. There are wards set upon this room to warn Galbatorix if a prisoner steps outside it, and there are hundreds of guards between here and the nearest gate. You'd be lucky to make it to the end of the hallway, if that. Perhaps, but I'd like to try. You'd only get yourself killed. Then help me. If you wanted, you could find a way to fool his wards. I can't. My oaths won't let me use magic against him. What of the guards, though? If you held them off long enough for me to reach the gate, I could hide myself in the city, and it wouldn't matter if Galbatorix knew. The city is his. Besides, wherever you went, he could find you with a spell. The only way you would be safe from him would be to get far away from here before the alarm roused him, and that you could not do even on Dragonback. There must be a way. If there were, he smiled sourly and looked down. It's pointless to consider. Frustrated, she shifted her gaze to the ceiling for a few moments. Then, at least let me out of these cuffs. He released his breath in a sound of exasperation. Just so I can stand up, she said. I hate lying on this stone, and it's making my eyes ache having to look at you down there. He hesitated, and then he rose to his feet in a single graceful movement, came over to the slab, and began to unfasten the padded restraints around her wrists and ankles. Don't think you can kill me, he said in a low voice. You can't. As soon as she was free, he retreated to his former position and again lowered himself onto the floor, where he sat staring into the distance. It was, she thought, his attempt to give her some privacy as she sat up and swung her legs over the edge of the slab. Her shift was in tatters, burned through in dozens of locations, and it did a poor job of concealing her form, not that it had covered much to begin with. The marble floor was cool against the soles of her feet as she made her way over to Murtaugh and sat next to him. She wrapped her arms around herself in an attempt to preserve her modesty. Was Tornak really your only friend growing up? She asked. Murtaugh still did not look at her. No, but he was as close to a father as I've ever had. He taught me, comforted me, berated me when I was too arrogant, and saved me from making a fool of myself more times than I can remember. If he were still alive, he would have beaten me silly for getting as drunk as I did the other day. You said he died during your escape from Urubayan? He snorted. I thought I was being clever. I bribed one of the watchmen to leave a side gate open for us. We were going to slip out of the city under the cover of darkness, and Galbatorix was only supposed to find out what had happened once it was too late to catch us. He knew from the very start, though. How, I'm not sure, but I guess he was scrying me the whole while. When Tornak and I went through the gate, we found soldiers waiting for us on the other side. Their orders were to bring us back unharmed, but we fought, and one of them killed Tornak. The finest swordsman in all the empire brought down by a knife in the back. But Galbatorix let you escape. I don't think he expected us to fight. Besides, his attention was directed elsewhere that night. She frowned as she saw the oddest half-smile appear on Murtaugh's face. I counted the days, he said. That was when the Rizak were in Palanker Valley, searching for Saphira's egg. So you see, Aragon lost his foster father almost at the same time I lost mine. Fate has a cruel sense of humor, don't you think? Yes, it does. But if Galbatorix could scry you, why didn't he track you down and bring you back to Urubayan later on? He was playing with me, I think. I went to stay at the estate of a man I believed I could trust. As usual, I was mistaken, though I only found that out later, once the twins brought me back here. Galbatorix knew where I was, and he knew I was still angry over Tornak's death, so he was content to leave me at the estate while he hunted for Aragon and Brahm. I surprised him, though. I left, and by the time he learned of my disappearance, I was already on my way to Dros Leona. That's why Galbatorix went to Dros Leona, you know. It wasn't to chastise Lord Tabor over his behavior, although he certainly did. It was to find me. But he was too late. By the time he arrived at the city, I had already met up with Aragon and Saphira, and we had set off for Gilead. Why did you leave? She asked. Didn't Aragon tell you? Because. No, not Dros Leona. Why did you leave the estate? You were safe there, or so you thought. So why did you leave? Murtaugh was quiet for a while. I wanted to strike back at Galbatorix, and I wanted to make a name for myself apart from my father's. My whole life, people have looked at me differently because I am the son of Morzin. I wanted them to respect me for my deeds, not his. He finally looked at her, a quick glance out of the corner of one eye. I suppose I got what I wanted, but again, fate has a cruel sense of humor. She wondered if there had been anyone else in Galbatorix's court whom he had cared for, but she decided it would be a dangerous topic to broach. So, instead, she asked, how much does Galbatorix really know about the Varden? Everything, so far as I can tell. He has more spies than you think. She pressed her arms against her belly as her gut twisted. Do you know of any way to kill him? A knife, a sword, an arrow, poison, magic, the usual ways. The problem is, he has too many spells wound about himself for anyone or anything to have a chance of harming him. Aragon is luckier than most. Galbatorix doesn't want to kill him, so he may get to attack the king more than once. But even if Aragon could attack him 100 times, he wouldn't find a way past Galbatorix's wards. Every puzzle has a solution, and every man has a weakness, Nasuda insisted. Does he love any of his concubines? The look on Murtaugh's face answered her well enough. Then he said, would it be so bad if Galbatorix remains king? The world he envisions is a good world. If he defeats the Varden, the whole of Algesia will finally be at peace. He'll put an end to the misuse of magic. Elves, dwarves, and humans will no longer have cause to hate each other. What's more, if the Varden lose, Aragon and I can be together as brothers ought to be. But if they win, it'll mean the death of Thorn and me. It'll have to. Oh, and what of me? She asked. If Galbatorix wins, shall I become his slave, to order about as he wills? Murtaugh refused to answer, but she saw the tendons on the back of his hands tighten. You can't give up, Murtaugh. What other choice do I have? He shouted, filling the room with echoes. She stood and stared down at him. You can fight. Look at me. Look at me. He reluctantly lifted his gaze. You can find ways to work against him. That's what you can do. Even if your oaths will allow only the smallest of rebellions, the smallest of rebellions might still prove to be his undoing. She restated his question for effect. What other choice do you have? You can go around feeling helpless and miserable for the rest of your life. You can let Galbatorix turn you into a monster. Or you can fight. She spread her arms so that he could see all of the burn marks on her. Do you enjoy hurting me? No, he exclaimed. Then fight, blast you. You have to fight or you will lose everything you are. As will Thorn. She held her ground as he sprang to his feet, lithe as a cat, and moved toward her until he was only a few inches away. The muscles in his jaw bunched and knotted while he glowered at her, breathing heavily through his nostrils. She recognized his expression, for it was one she had seen many times before. His was the look of a man whose pride had been offended and who wanted to lash out at the person who had insulted him. It was dangerous to keep pushing him, but she knew she had to, for she might never get the chance again. If I can keep fighting, she said, then so can you. Back to the stone, he said in a harsh voice. I know you're not a coward, Murtaugh. Better to die than to live as a slave to one such as Galbatorix. At least then you might accomplish some good, and your name might be remembered with a measure of kindness after you're gone. Back to the stone, he growled, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her over to the slab. She allowed him to push her onto the ash-colored block, fasten the restraints around her wrists and ankles, and then tighten the strap around her head. When he finished, he stood looking at her, his eyes dark and wild, the lines of his body like cords stretched taut. You have to decide whether you are willing to risk your life in order to save yourself, she said. You and Thorn both. And you have to decide now, while there is still time. Ask yourself, what would Tornak have wanted you to do? Without answering, Murtaugh extended his right arm and placed his hand upon the upper part of her chest, his palm hot against her skin. Her breath hitched at the shock of the contact. Then, hardly louder than a whisper, he began to speak in the ancient language. As the strange words tumbled from his lips, her fear grew ever stronger. He spoke for what seemed like minutes. She felt no different when he stopped, but that was neither a favorable nor an unfavorable sign where magic was concerned. Cool air washed over the patch on her chest, chilling it as Murtaugh lifted his hand away. He stepped back then and started to walk past her, toward the entrance of the chamber. She was about to call out to him, to ask what he had done to her, when he paused and said, That should shield you from the pain of most any wound, but you'll have to pretend otherwise, or Galbatorix will discover what I've done. And then he left. Thank you, she whispered to the empty room. She spent a long time pondering their conversation. It seemed unlikely that Galbatorix had sent Murtaugh to talk with her, but unlikely or not, it remained a possibility. Also, she found herself torn as to whether Murtaugh was, at heart, a good person or a bad one. She thought back to King Hrothgar, who had been like an uncle to her when she was growing up, and how Murtaugh had killed him on the burning plains. Then she thought of Murtaugh's childhood and the many hardships he had faced, and how he had allowed Aragon and Saphira to go free when he could have just as easily brought them to Urubayan. Yet even if Murtaugh had once been honorable and trustworthy, she knew that his enforced servitude might have corrupted him. In the end, she decided she would ignore Murtaugh's past and judge him on his actions in the present and those alone. Good, bad, or some combination thereof, he was a potential ally, and she needed his help if she could get it. If he proved false, then she would be no worse off than she already was. But if he proved true, then she might be able to escape from Urubayan, and that was well worth the risk. In the absence of pain, she slept long and deep for the first time since her arrival at the capital. She awoke feeling more hopeful than before, and again fell to tracing the lines painted on the ceiling. The thin blue line she was following led her to notice a small white shape on the corner of a tile that she had previously overlooked. It took her a moment to realize that the discoloration was where a chip had fallen free. The sight amused her, for she found it humorous, and somewhat comforting, to know that Galbatorix's perfect chamber was not quite so perfect after all, and that, despite his pretensions otherwise, he was not omniscient or infallible. When the door to the chamber next opened, it was her jailer, bringing what she guessed was a midday meal. She asked him if she could eat first, before he let her up, for she said she was more hungry than anything else, which was not entirely untrue. To her satisfaction, he agreed, though he uttered not a word, only smiled his hideous, clamp-like smile and seated himself on the edge of the slab. As he spooned warm gruel into her mouth, her mind raced as she tried to plan for every contingency, for she knew she would have only one chance at success. Anticipation made it difficult for her to stomach the bland food. Nevertheless, she managed, and when the bowl was empty and she had drunk her fill, she readied herself. The man had, as always, placed the food tray by the base of the far wall, close to where Murtaugh had been sitting and perhaps 10 feet from the door to the privy room. Once she was free of her manacles, she slid off the block of stone. The gourd-headed man reached over to take hold of her left arm, but she raised a hand and, in her sweetest voice, said, I can stand by myself now, thank you. Her jailer hesitated, then he smiled again and clacked his teeth together twice, as if to say, well then, I'm happy for you. They started toward the privy room, she in the front and he slightly to the rear. As she took her third step, she deliberately twisted her right ankle and stumbled diagonally across the room. The man shouted and tried to catch her. She felt his thick fingers close on the air above her neck, but he was too slow, and she eluded his grasp. She fell lengthwise onto the tray, breaking the pitcher, which still held a fair amount of watered wine, and sending the wooden bowl clattering across the floor. By design, she landed with her right hand underneath her, and as soon as she felt the tray, she began to search with her fingers for the metal spoon. "Ah!" she exclaimed, as if hurt, then turned to look up at the man, doing her best to appear chagrined. "Maybe I wasn't ready after all," she said, and gave him an apologetic smile. Her thumb touched the handle of the spoon, and she grabbed hold of it even as the man pulled her upright by her other arm. He looked her over and wrinkled his nose, appearing disgusted by her wine-soaked shift. While he did, she reached behind herself and slid the handle of the spoon through a hole near the hem of her garment. Then she held up her hand, as if to show that she had taken nothing. The man grunted, grabbed her other arm, and marched her to the privy room. As she entered, he shuffled back toward the tray, muttering under his breath. The moment she had closed the door, she pulled the spoon out of her shift and placed it between her lips, holding it there as she plucked several strands of hair from the back of her head, where they were longest. Moving as fast as she could, she pinched one end of the gathered hairs between the fingers of her left hand and then rolled the loose strands down her thighs with the palm of her right, twisting them together into a single cord. Her skin grew cold as she realized the cord was too short. Fumbling in her urgency, she tied off the ends, then placed the cord on the ground. She plucked another group of hairs and rolled them into a second cord, which she tied off like the first. Knowing that she had only seconds remaining, she dropped to one knee and knotted the two strands together. Then she took the spoon from her mouth and, with the slim length of thread, she bound the spoon to the outside of her left leg, where the edge of her shift would cover it. It had to go on her left leg because Galbatorix always sat to her right. She stood and checked that the spoon remained hidden, and then she took a few steps to make sure it would not fall. It did not. Relieved, she allowed herself to exhale. Now her challenge was to return to the slab without letting her jailer notice what she had done. The man was waiting for her when she opened the door to the privy room. He scowled at her, and his sparse eyebrows met, forming a single straight line. "Spoon," he said, mashing the word with his tongue as if it were a piece of overcooked parsnip. She lifted her chin and pointed toward the rear of the privy room. His scowl deepened. He went into the room and carefully examined the walls, floors, ceiling, and all else before stomping back out. He clacked his teeth together again and scratched his bulbous head, appearing unhappy and, she thought, a little hurt that she would bother to throw away the spoon. She had been kind to him, and she knew an act of such petty defiance would puzzle him and make him angry. She resisted the urge to pull away when he stepped forward, put his weighty hands on her head, and combed through her hair with his fingers. When he did not find the spoon, his face drooped. He grabbed her arm then and walked her over to the slab and again placed her in the manacles. Then, his expression sullen, he picked up the tray and shuffled out of the room. She waited until she was absolutely sure he was gone before she reached out with the fingers of her left hand and, inch by inch, pulled up the edge of her shift. A broad smile passed across her face as she felt the bowl of the spoon with the tip of her index finger. Now she had a weapon. A crown of ice and snow. When the first pale rays of light streaked across the surface of the dimpled sea, illuminating the crests of the translucent waves, which glittered as if carved from crystal, then Aragon roused himself from his waking dreams and looked to the northwest, curious to see what the light revealed of the clouds building in the distance. What he beheld was disconcerting. The clouds encompassed nearly half the horizon, and the largest of the dense white plumes looked as tall as the peaks of the Bior Mountains, too tall for Saphira to climb over. The only open sky lay behind her, and even that would be lost to them as the arms of the storm closed in. "We shall have to fly through it," Glatter said, and Aragon felt Saphira's trepidation. "Why not try to go around?" she asked. Through Saphira, Aragon was aware of Glatter examining the structure of the clouds. At last the Golden Dragon said, "I do not want you flying too far off course. We still have many leagues to cover, and if your strength fails you, then you can lend me yours to keep us aloft." HMPH. Even so, it is best to be cautious in our recklessness. I have seen the likes of this storm before. It is larger than you think. To skirt it, you would have to fly so far to the west that you would end up beyond Vroingard, and it would probably take another day to reach land. "The distance to Vroingard isn't that great," she said. "No, but the wind will slow us. Besides, my instincts tell me that the storm extends all the way to the island. One way or another, we shall have to fly through it. However, there's no need to go through its very heart. Do you see the notch between those two small pillars off to the west? Yes. Go there, and perhaps we can then find a safe path through the clouds. Aragon grasped the front of the saddle as Saphira dropped her left shoulder and turned westward, aiming herself toward the notch Gladder had indicated. He yawned and rubbed his eyes as she leveled out. Then he twisted round and dug out an apple and a few strips of dried beef from the bags strapped behind him. It was a meager breakfast, but his hunger was slight, and eating a large meal while riding Saphira often made him queasy. While he ate, he alternated between watching the clouds and gazing at the sparkling sea. He found it unsettling that there was nothing but water beneath them and that the nearest solid ground, the mainland, was, by his estimate, over 50 miles away. He shivered as he imagined sinking down and down into the cold, clutching depths of the sea. He wondered what lay at the bottom, and it occurred to him that with his magic, he could likely travel there and find out, but the thought held no appeal. The watery abyss was too dark and too dangerous for his liking. It was not, he felt, a place where his sort of life ought to venture. Better, instead, to leave it to whatever strange creatures already lived there. As the morning wore on, it became apparent that the clouds were farther away than they had first seemed and that, as Gladder had said, the storm was larger than either Aragon or Saphira had originally imagined. A light headwind sprang up, and Saphira's flight became somewhat more labored, but she continued to make good progress. When they were still some leagues from the leading edge of the storm, Saphira surprised Aragon and Gladder by slipping into a shallow dive and flying down close to the surface of the water. As she descended, Gladder said, "Saphira, what are you about?" "I'm curious," she replied. "And I would like to rest my wings before entering the clouds." She skimmed over the waves, her reflection below and her shadow in front mirroring her every move like two ghostly companions, one dark and one light. Then she swiveled her wings on edge and, with 3 quick flaps, slowed herself and landed upon the water. A fan of spray shot up on either side of her neck as her chest plowed into the waves, sprinkling Aragon with hundreds of droplets. The water was cold, but after so long aloft, the air felt pleasantly warm, so warm, in fact, that Aragon unwrapped his cloak and pulled off his gloves. Saphira folded her wings and floated along peacefully, bobbing up and down with the motion of the waves. Aragon spotted several clumps of brown seaweed off to the right. The plants were branched like scrub brush and had berry-sized bladders at joints along the stems. Far overhead, near the height Saphira had been, Aragon spotted a pair of albatrosses with black-tipped wings flying away from the massive wall of clouds. The sight only deepened his unease. The seabirds reminded him of the time he had seen a pack of wolves running alongside a herd of deer as the animals fled a forest fire in the spine. "If we had any sense," he said to Saphira, "we would turn around." "If we had any sense, we would leave Algesia and never return," she rejoined. Arching her neck, she dipped her muzzle into the seawater, then shook her head and ran her crimson tongue in and out of her mouth several times, as if she had tasted something unpleasant. Then Aragon felt a sense of panic from Gladder, and the old dragon roared in his mind, "Take off. Now, now, now. Take off." Saphira wasted no time on questions. With a sound like thunder, she opened her wings and began to beat them as she reared out of the water. Leaning forward, Aragon grabbed the edge of the saddle to keep from being thrown backward. The flapping of Saphira's wings threw up a screen of mist that half blinded him, so he used his mind to search for whatever had alarmed Gladder. From deep below, rising toward Saphira's underside faster than Aragon would have believed possible, he felt something that was cold and huge, and filled with a ravenous, insatiable hunger. He tried to frighten it, tried to turn it away, but the creature was alien and implacable and seemed not to notice his efforts. In the strange, lightless caverns of its consciousness, he glimpsed memories of uncounted years spent lurking alone in the icy sea, hunting and being hunted. His own panic mounting, Aragon groped for the hilt of Brisinger even as Saphira wrenched herself free from the grasp of the water and began to climb into the air. "Saphira, hurry," he silently shouted. She slowly gained speed and altitude, and then a fountain of white water erupted behind her, and Aragon saw a pair of shiny gray jaws emerge from within the plume. The jaws were large enough for a horse and rider to pass through unscathed and were filled with hundreds of glinting white teeth. Saphira was aware of what he saw, and she twisted violently to the side in an attempt to escape the gaping maw, clipping the water with the tip of her wing. An instant later, Aragon heard and felt the creature's jaws snap shut. The needle-like teeth missed Saphira's tail by inches. As the monster fell back into the water, more of its body became visible. The head was long and angular. A bony crest jutted out over the eyes, and from the outer part of each crest grew a ropey tendril that Aragon guessed to be over 6 feet in length. The neck of the creature reminded him of a giant, rippling snake. What was visible of the creature's torso was smooth and powerfully built and looked incredibly dense. A pair of oar-shaped flippers extended from the sides of its chest, flailing helplessly in the air. The creature landed upon its side, and a second, even larger burst of spray flew toward the sky. Just before the waves closed over the monster's shape, Aragon looked into its one upward-facing eye, which was as black as a drop of tar. The malevolence contained therein, the sheer hate and fury and frustration that he perceived in the creature's unblinking gaze, was enough to make Aragon shiver and wish he were in the center of the Hatterack Desert. For only there, he felt, would he be safe from the creature's ancient hunger. Heart-pounding, he relaxed his grip on Brisinger and slumped over the front of the saddle. What was that? A nidwall, said Glatter. Aragon frowned. He did not remember reading about any such thing in Elsmera. And what is a nidwall? They are rare and not often spoken about. They are to the sea what the fangor are to the air. Both are cousins to the dragons. Though the differences in our appearance are greater, the nidwall are closer to us than are the screeching fangor. They are intelligent, and they even have a structure similar to the Eldenari within their chest, which we believe enables them to remain submerged for extended periods of time at great depth. Can they breathe fire? No, but like the fangor, they often use the power of their minds to incapacitate their prey, which more than one dragon has discovered to their dismay. They would eat their own kind. Saphira said. To them, we are nothing alike, Glatter replied. But they do eat their own, which is one reason there are so few Nidwalar. They have no interest in happenings outside their own realm, and every attempt to reason with them has met with failure. It is odd to encounter one so close to shore. There was a time when they were only found several days' flight from land, where the sea is the deepest. It seems they have grown either bold or desperate since the fall of the riders. Aragon shivered again as he remembered the feel of the Nidwall's mind. Why did neither you nor Oromas ever teach us of them? There is much we did not teach you, Aragon. We had only so much time, and it was best spent trying to arm you against Galbatorix, not every dark creature that haunts the unexplored regions of Algesia. Then there are other things like the Nidwall that we don't know about? A few. Will you tell us of them, Ebrithel? Saphira asked. I will make a pact with you, Saphira, and with you, Aragon. Let us wait a week, and if we are still alive and still possessed of our freedom, I will happily spend the next 10 years teaching you about every single race I know of, including every variety of beetle, of which there are multitudes. But until then, let us concentrate upon the task before us. Are we agreed? Aragon and Saphira reluctantly agreed, and they spoke of it no more. The headwind strengthened into a blustery gale as they neared the front of the storm, slowing Saphira until she was flying at half her normal speed. Now and then, powerful gusts rocked her and sometimes stopped her dead in her course for a few moments. They always knew when the gusts were about to strike, for they could see a silvery, scale-like pattern rushing toward them across the surface of the water. Since dawn, the clouds had only increased in size, and up close, they were even more intimidating. Near the bottom, they were dark and purplish, with curtains of driving rain connecting the storm with the sea like a gauzy umbilical cord. Higher up, the clouds were the color of tarnished silver, while the very tops were a pure, blinding white and appeared as solid as the flanks of Trondheim. To the north, over the center of the storm, the clouds had formed a gigantic flat-topped anvil that loomed over all else, as if the gods themselves intended to forge some strange and terrible instrument. As Saphira soared between two bulging white columns, beside which she was no more than a speck, and the sea vanished beneath a field of pillow-like clouds, the headwind abated and the air grew rough and choppy, swirling about them without an identifiable direction. Aragon clenched his teeth to keep them from clacking, and his stomach lurched as Saphira dropped a half-dozen feet and then, just as quickly, rose more than 20 feet straight up. Glatter said, have you any experience storm flying other than the time you were caught in a thunderstorm between Palanker Valley and Yazwak? No, said Saphira, short and grim. Glatter seemed to have expected her answer, for without hesitation he began to instruct her about the intricacies of navigating the fantastic cloudscape. Look for patterns of movement and take note of the formations around you, he said. By them, you may guess where the wind is strongest and the direction it is blowing. Much of what he said Saphira already knew, but as Glatter kept talking, the old dragon's calm demeanor steadied both her and Aragon. Had they felt alarm or fear in the old dragon's mind, it would have caused them to doubt themselves, and perhaps Gladder was aware of that. A stray, wind-torn scrap of cloud lay across Saphira's path. Instead of flying around it, she went straight through, piercing the cloud like a glittering blue spear. As the gray mist enveloped them, the sound of the wind grew muted, and Aragon squinted and held a hand before his face to keep his eyes clear. When they shot out of the cloud, millions of tiny droplets clung to Saphira's body, and she sparkled as if diamonds had been affixed to her already dazzling scales. Her flight continued to be unsettled. One moment she would be level, but the next the unruly air might shove her sideways, or an unexpected updraft might lift one wing and send her slewing off in the opposite direction. Just sitting on her back as she fought against the turbulence was tiring, while for Saphira herself, it was a miserable, frustrating struggle made all the more difficult by knowing that it was far from over and that she had no choice but to continue on. After an hour or two they still had not sighted the far side of the tempest. Gladder said, "We have to turn. You've gone as far west as is prudent, and if we're to dare the full wrath of the storm, we had best do it now, before you are any more exhausted." Without a word, Saphira wheeled north toward the vast, towering cliff of sunlit clouds that occupied the heart of the giant storm. As they neared the ridged face of the cliff, which was the largest single thing Aragon had ever seen, larger even than Farthendur, blue flashes illuminated the folds within as lightning crawled upward, toward the top of the anvil head. A moment later, a clap of thunder shook the sky, and Aragon covered his ears with his hands. He knew that his wards would protect them from the lightning, but he still felt apprehensive about venturing near the crackling bolts of energy. If Saphira was frightened, he did not sense it. All he could feel was her determination. She quickened the beat of her wings, and a few minutes later they arrived at the face of the cliff and then plunged through it and into the center of the storm. Twilight surrounded them, gray and featureless. It was as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The clouds made it impossible for Aragon to judge any distance past the tips of Saphira's nose, tail, and wings. They were effectively blind, and only the constant pull of their weight let them differentiate up from down. Aragon opened his mind and allowed his consciousness to expand as far as he could, but he felt no other living thing besides Saphira and Gladder, not even a single stray bird. Fortunately, Saphira retained her sense of direction. They would not get lost. And by continuing to search with his mind for other beings, whether plant or animal, Aragon could ensure that they would not fly straight into the side of a mountain. He also cast a spell that Oromas had taught him, a spell that informed him and Saphira exactly how close they were to the water, or the ground, at any given moment. From the moment they entered the cloud, the ever-present moisture began to accumulate on Aragon's skin and soak into his woolen clothes, weighing them down. It was an annoyance he could have ignored had not the combination of water and wind been so chilling. It would have soon drained the heat from his limbs and killed him. Therefore, he cast another spell, which filtered the air around him of any visible droplets, as well as, at her request, the air around Saphira's eyes, for the moisture kept collecting on their surface, forcing her to blink all too frequently. The wind inside the anvil head was surprisingly gentle. Aragon made a comment to that effect to Gladder, but the old dragon stayed as grim as ever. "We have yet to encounter the worst of it." The truth of his words soon became evident when a ferocious updraft slammed into Saphira's underside and carried her thousands of feet higher, where the air was too thin for Aragon to breathe properly and the mist froze into countless tiny crystals that stung his nose and cheeks and the webbing of Saphira's wings like so many razor-sharp knives. Pinning her wings against her sides, Saphira dove forward, trying to escape the updraft. After a few seconds, the pressure underneath her vanished, only to be replaced by an equally powerful downdraft, which shoved her toward the waves at a frightful speed. As they fell, the ice crystals melted, forming large, globular raindrops that seemed to float weightlessly alongside Saphira. Lightning flared nearby, an eerie blue glow through the veil of clouds, and Aragon shouted with pain as the thunder boomed around them. His ears still ringing, he ripped 2 small pieces off the edge of his cloak, then rolled up the scraps of cloth and screwed them into his ears, forcing them in as far as he could. Only near the bottom of the clouds did Saphira manage to break free of the fast-flowing stream of air. As soon as she did, a second updraft seized hold of her and, like a giant hand, pushed her skyward. Then and for a long while after, Aragon lost all track of time. The raging wind was too strong for Saphira to resist, and she continued to rise and fall in the cycling air, like a piece of flotsam caught in a whirlpool. She made some headway, a few scant miles, dearly won and with great effort retained, but every time she extricated herself from one of the looping currents, she found herself trapped in another. It was humbling for Aragon to realize that he, Saphira, and Gladder were helpless before the storm and that, for all their might, they could not hope to match the power of the elements. Twice, the wind nearly drove Saphira into the crashing waves. On both occasions, the downdrafts cast her out of the underbelly of the storm into the squalls of rain that pummeled the sea below. The second time it happened, Aragon looked over Saphira's shoulder and, for an instant, he thought he saw the long, dark shape of the Nidwal resting upon the heaving water. However, when the next burst of lightning came, the shape was gone, and he wondered whether the shadows had played a trick upon him. As Saphira's strength waned, she fought the wind less and less and, instead, allowed it to take her where it would. She only made an effort to defy the storm when she got too close to the water. Otherwise, she stilled her wings and exerted herself as little as possible. Aragon felt when Gladder began to feed her a thread of energy to help sustain her, but even that was not enough to allow her to do more than hold her place. Eventually, what light there was began to fade, and despair settled upon Aragon. They had spent the better part of the day being tossed about by the storm, and still it showed no sign of subsiding, nor did it seem as if Saphira was anywhere close to its perimeter. Once the sun had set, Aragon could not even see the tip of his nose, and there was no difference between when his eyes were open and when they were closed. It was as if a huge pile of black wool had been packed around him and Saphira, and indeed, the darkness seemed to have a weight to it, as if it were a palpable substance pressing against them from all sides. Every few seconds, another flash of lightning split the gloom, sometimes hidden within the clouds, sometimes streaking across their field of vision, glaring with the brightness of a dozen suns and leaving the air tasting like iron. After the searing brightness of the closer discharges, the night seemed twice as dark, and Aragon and Saphira alternated between being blinded by the light and being blinded by the utter black that followed. As close as the bolts came, they never struck Saphira, but the constant roll of thunder left Aragon and Saphira feeling sick from the noise. How long they continued like that, Aragon could not tell. Then, at some point in the night, Saphira entered a torrent of rising air that was far larger and far stronger than any they had previously encountered. As soon as it struck them, Saphira began to struggle against it in an attempt to escape, but the force of the wind was so great, she could barely hold her wings level. At last, frustrated, she roared and loosed a jet of flame from her maw, illuminating a small area of the surrounding ice crystals, which glittered like gems. "Help me," she said to Aragon and Gladder. "I can't do this by myself." So the two of them melded their minds and, with Gladder supplying the needed energy, Aragon shouted, "Ganga Fram." The spell propelled Saphira forward, but ever so slowly, for moving at right angles to the wind was like swimming across the Honora River during the height of the spring snowmelt. Even as Saphira advanced horizontally, the current continued to sweep her upward at a dizzying rate. Soon Aragon began to notice that he was growing short of breath, and yet they remained caught within the torrent of air. "This is taking too long and it's costing us too much energy," said Gladder. "End the spell." "But, end the spell. We can't win free before the two of you faint. We'll have to ride the wind until it weakens enough for Saphira to escape." "How?" she asked while Aragon did as Gladder instructed. The exhaustion and sense of defeat that muddied her thoughts made Aragon feel a pang of concern for her. "Aragon, you must amend the spell you are using to warm yourself to include Saphira and me. It is going to grow cold, colder than even the bitterest winter in the spine, and without magic, we shall freeze to death." "Even you?" "I will crack like a piece of hot glass dropped in snow. Next you must cast a spell to gather the air around you and Saphira and to hold it there, so you may still breathe. But it must also allow the stale air to escape, or else you will suffocate. The wording of the spell is complicated, and you must not make any mistakes, so listen carefully. It goes as such." Once Gladder had recited the necessary phrases in the ancient language, Aragon repeated them back to him, and when the dragon was satisfied with his pronunciation, Aragon cast the spell. Then he amended his other piece of magic as Gladder had instructed, so the three of them were shielded from the cold. They waited, then, while the wind lifted them higher and higher. Minutes passed, and Aragon began to wonder if they would ever stop, or if they would keep hurtling upward until they were level with the moon and the stars. It occurred to him that perhaps this was how shooting stars were made. A bird or a dragon or some other earthly creature snatched upward by the inexorable wind and thrown skyward with such speed, they flamed like siege arrows. If so, then he guessed he, Saphira, and Gladder would make the brightest, most spectacular shooting star in living memory, if anyone was close enough to see their demise so far out to sea. The howling of the wind gradually grew softer. Even the bone-jarring claps of thunder seemed muted, and when Aragon dug the scraps of cloth out of his ears, he was astonished by the hushed silence that surrounded them. He still heard a faint susurration in the background, like the sound of a small forest brook, but other than that, it was quiet, blessedly quiet. As the clamor of the angry storm faded, he also noticed that the strain imposed by his spells was increasing, not so much from the enchantment that prevented their bodily heat from dissipating too quickly, but from the enchantment that collected and compressed the atmosphere in front of him and Saphira so that they could fill their lungs as they normally did. For whatever reason, the energy required to maintain the second spell multiplied out of all proportion to the first, and he soon felt the symptoms that indicated the magic was upon the verge of stealing away what little remained of his life force. The coldness of his hands, an uncertainty in the beating of his heart, and an overwhelming sense of lethargy, which was perhaps the most worrying sign of all. Then Gladder began to assist him. With relief, Aragon felt his burden decrease as the dragon's strength flowed into him, a flush of fever-like heat that washed away his lethargy and restored the vigor of his limbs. And so they continued. At long last, Saphira detected a slackening of the wind, slight but noticeable, and she began to prepare to fly out of the stream of air. Before she could, the clouds above them thinned, and Aragon glimpsed a few glittering specks, stars, white and silvery and brighter than any he had seen before. "Look," he said. Then the clouds opened up around them, and Saphira rose out of the storm and hung above it, balancing precariously atop the column of rushing wind. Laid out below them, Aragon saw the whole of the storm, extending for what must have been 100 miles in every direction. The center appeared as an arching, mushroom-like dome, smoothed off by the vicious crosswinds that swept west to east and threatened to topple Saphira from her uncertain perch. The clouds both near and far were milky and seemed almost luminous, as if lit from within. They looked beautiful and benign, placid, unchanging formations that betrayed nothing of the violence inside. Then Aragon noticed the sky, and he gasped, for it contained more stars than he had thought existed. Red, blue, white, gold, they lay strewn upon the firmament like handfuls of sparkling dust. The constellations he was familiar with were still present but now set among thousands of fainter stars, which he beheld for the very first time. And not only did the stars appear brighter, the void between them appeared darker. It was as if, whenever he had looked at the sky before, there had been a haze over his eyes that had kept him from seeing the true glory of the stars. He stared at the spectacular display for several moments, awestruck by the glorious, random, unknowable nature of the twinkling lights. Only when he finally lowered his gaze did it occur to him that there was something unusual about the purple-hued horizon. Instead of the sky and the sea meeting in a straight line, as they ought to and always had before, the juncture between them curved, like the edge of an unimaginably big circle. It was such a strange sight, it took Aragon a half-dozen seconds to understand what he was seeing, and when he did, his scalp tingled and he felt as if the breath had been knocked out of him. "The world is round," he whispered. "The sky is hollow and the world is round." "So it would appear," Gladder said, but he seemed equally impressed. "I heard tell of this from a wild dragon, but I never thought to see it myself." To the east, a faint yellow glow tinted a section of the horizon, presaging the return of the sun. Aragon guessed that if Saphira held her position for another 4 or 5 minutes, they would see it rise, even though it would still be hours before the warm, life-giving rays reached the water below. Saphira balanced there for a moment more, the three of them suspended between the stars and the earth, floating in the silent twilight like dispossessed spirits. They were in a nowhere place, neither part of the heavens nor part of the world below, a moat passing through the margin separating two immensities. Then Saphira tipped forward and half flew, half fell northward, for the air was so sparse that her wings could not fully support her weight once she left the stream of rising wind. As she hurtled downward, Aragon said, "If we had enough jewels, and if we stored enough energy in them, do you think we could fly all the way to the moon?" "Who knows what is possible?" said Gladder. When Aragon was a child, Carvajal and Palanquer Valley had been all he had known. He had heard of the Empire, of course, but it had never seemed quite real until he began to travel within it. Later still, his mental picture of the world had expanded to include the rest of Algesia and, vaguely, the other lands he had read of. And now he realized that what he had thought of as so large was actually but a small part of a much greater whole. It was as if his point of view had, within a few seconds, gone from that of an ant to that of an eagle. For the sky was hollow, and the world was round. It made him reevaluate and recategorize everything. The war between the Varden and the Empire seemed inconsequential when compared with the true size of the world, and he thought how petty were most of the hurts and concerns that bedeviled people, when looked at from on high. To Saphira, he said, if only everyone could see what we have seen, perhaps there would be less fighting in the world. You cannot expect wolves to become sheep. No, but neither do the wolves have to be cruel to the sheep. Saphira soon dropped back into the darkness of the clouds, but she managed to avoid getting caught in another cycle of rising and falling air. Instead, she glided for many miles, skipping off the tops of the other, lower updrafts packed within the storm, using them to help conserve her strength. An hour or two later, the fog parted, and they flew out of the huge mass of clouds that formed the center of the storm. They descended to skim over the insubstantial foothills piled about its base, which gradually flattened into a quilted blanket that covered everything in sight, with the sole exception of the anvil head itself. By the time the sun finally appeared above the horizon, neither Aragon nor Saphira had the energy to pay much attention to their surroundings. Nor was there anything in the sameness below to attract their attention. It was Gladder, then, who said, Saphira, there, to your right. Do you see it? Aragon lifted his head off his folded arms and squinted as his eyes adjusted to the brightness. Some miles to the north, a ring of mountains rose out of the clouds. The peaks were clad in snow and ice, and together they looked like an ancient, jagged crown resting atop the layers of mist. The eastward-facing scarps shone brilliantly in the light of the morning sun, while long blue shadows cloaked the western sides and stretched dwindling into the distance, tenebrous daggers upon the billowy, snow-white plain. Aragon straightened in his seat, hardly daring to believe that their journey might be at an end. Behold, said Gladder, Arisfelduin, the fire mountains that guard the heart of Vroingard. Fly quickly, Saphira, for we have but a little farther to go. Burrow grubs. They caught her at the intersection of two identical corridors, both lined with pillars and torches and scarlet pennants bearing the twisting gold flame that was Galbatorix's insignia. Nasuda had not expected to escape, not really, but she could not help but feel disappointed at her failure. If nothing else, she had hoped to cover more distance before they recaptured her. She fought the whole way as the soldiers dragged her back to the chamber that had been her prison. The men wore chest plates and vambraces, but she still managed to scratch their faces and bite their hands, wounding a pair of the men rather severely. The soldiers uttered exclamations of dismay when they entered the hall of the soothsayer and saw what she had done to her jailer. Careful not to step in the pooling blood, they carried her to the slab of stone, strapped her down, then hurried away, leaving her alone with the corpse. She shouted at the ceiling and yanked at her restraints, angry with herself for not having done better. Still simmering, she glanced at the body on the floor, then quickly looked away. In death, the man's expression seemed accusatory, and she could not bear to gaze upon it. After she stole the spoon, she had spent hours grinding the end of the handle against the stone slab. The spoon had been made of soft iron, so it was easy to shape. She had thought that Galbatorix and Murtaugh would visit her next, but instead it was her jailer, bringing her what might have been a late dinner. He had started to undo her manacles in preparation for escorting her to the privy room. The moment he freed her left hand, she stabbed him underneath the chin with the sharpened handle of the spoon, burying the utensil in the folds of his waddle. The man squealed, a horrible, high-pitched sound that reminded her of a pig at slaughter, and spun thrice around, flailing his arms, then fell to the floor, where he lay thrashing and frothing and drumming his heels for what seemed an unreasonably long time. Killing him had troubled her. She did not think the man had been evil, she was not sure what he had been, but there had been a simpleness to him that made her feel as if she had taken advantage of him. Still, she had done what was necessary, and though she now found it unpleasant to consider, she remained convinced that her actions had been justified. As the man lay convulsing in his death throes, she had unfastened the rest of the restraints and jumped off the slab. Then, steeling her nerve, she pulled the spoon out of the man's neck, which, like a stopper removed from the bung of a barrel, released a spray of blood that splattered her legs and caused her to jump backward while stifling a curse. The two guards outside the hall of the soothsayer had been easy enough to deal with. She had caught them by surprise and killed the right-hand guard in much the same way she had killed her jailer. Then she had drawn the dagger from the guard's belt and attacked the other man even as he struggled to bring his pike to bear upon her. Up close, a pike was was no match for a dagger, and she had unseamed him before he had a chance to escape or raise the alarm. She had not gotten very far after that. Whether because of Galbatorix's spells or just plain bad luck, she ran headlong into a group of 5 soldiers, and they had quickly, if not easily, subdued her. It could not have been more than half an hour later when she heard a large group of men in iron-shod boots march up to the door of the chamber, and then Galbatorix stormed in, followed by several guards. As always, he stopped at the edge of her line of sight, and there he stood, a tall, dark figure with an angular face, only the outlines of which were visible. She saw his head turn as he took in the scene. Then, in a cold voice, he said, "How did this happen?" A soldier with a plume on his helm scurried in front of Galbatorix, knelt, and held out her sharpened spoon. "Sire, we found this in one of the men outside." The king took the spoon and turned it over in his hands. "I see." His head swiveled toward her. He gripped the ends of the spoon and, without discernible effort, bent it until it snapped in two. "You knew you could not escape, and yet you insisted upon trying. I'll not have you killing my men merely to spite me. You have not the right to take their lives. You have not the right to do anything unless I allow it." He flung the pieces of metal upon the floor. Then he turned and stalked out of the hall of the soothsayer, his heavy cape flapping behind him. 2 of the soldiers removed her jailer's body, then scoured the chamber of his blood, cursing her as they scrubbed. Once they had left and she was again alone, she allowed herself a sigh, and some of the tension in her limbs vanished. She wished she had had a chance to eat, for now that the excitement was over, she found she was hungry. Worse, she suspected she would have to wait hours before she could hope to have her next meal, assuming that Galbatorix did not decide to punish her by withholding food. Her musings about bread and roasts and tall glasses of wine were short-lived, as she again heard the sound of many boots in the passageway outside her cell. Startled, she tried to mentally prepare herself for whatever unpleasantness was about to come, for it would be unpleasant, she was sure. The door to the chamber crashed open, and 2 sets of footsteps echoed in the octagonal room as Murtaugh and Galbatorix walked over to her. Murtaugh positioned himself where he usually did, but without the brazier to occupy himself. He crossed his arms, leaned against the wall, and glared at the floor. What she could see of his expression beneath his silver half-mask did not comfort her. The lines of his face seemed even harder than normal, and there was something about the cast of his mouth that sent a chill of fear into her bones. Instead of sitting, as was his wont, Galbatorix stood behind and somewhat to the side of her head, where she could feel his presence more than she could see it. He extended his long, claw-like hands over her. In them, he held a small box decorated with lines of carved horn that might have formed glyphs from the ancient language. Most disconcerting of all, a faint scree-scree sound came from within the container, soft as the scratching of a mouse, but no less distinct. With the pad of his thumb, Galbatorix pushed open the box's sliding lid. Then he reached inside and pulled out what appeared to be a large, ivory-colored maggot. The creature was almost 3 inches long, and it had a tiny mouth at one end, with which it uttered the scree-scree she had heard before, announcing its displeasure to the world. It was plump and pleated, like a caterpillar, but if it had any legs, they were so small as to be invisible. As the creature wiggled in a vain attempt to free itself from between Galbatorix's fingers, the king said, "This is a burrow grub. It is not what it appears to be. Few things are, but in the case of burrow grubs, that is all the more true. They are found in only one place in Algesia and are far more difficult to capture than you might suppose. Take it, then, as a sign of my regard for you, Nasuda, daughter of a jihad, that I deign to use one on you." His voice dropped in tone, becoming even more intimate. "I would not, however, wish to exchange places with you." The scree-scree of the burrow grub increased in volume as Galbatorix dropped it onto the bare skin of her right arm, just below the elbow. She flinched as the disgusting creature landed on her. It was heavier than it looked, and its underside gripped her with what felt like hundreds of little hooks. The burrow grub squalled for a moment more, then it gathered up its body in a tight bundle and hopped several inches up her arm. She wrenched at her bonds, hoping to dislodge the grub, but it continued to cling to her. Again it hopped. And again, and now it was on her shoulder, the hooks pinching and digging into her skin like a strip of minute cockleburrs. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the burrow grub lift up its eyeless head and point it toward her face, as if testing the air. Its tiny mouth opened, and she saw that it had sharp cutting mandibles behind its upper and lower lips. "Scree-scree?" said the burrow grub. "Scree-scraw?" "Not there," Galbatorix said, and he spoke a word in the ancient language. On hearing it, the burrow grub swung away from her head, for which she felt a measure of relief. Then it began to worm its way back down her arm. Few things frightened her. The touch of the hot iron frightened her. The thought that Galbatorix might reign forevermore in Urubayan frightened her. Death, of course, frightened her, although not so much because she feared the end of her existence as because she feared leaving undone all the things she still hoped to accomplish. But, for whatever reason, the sight and feel of the burrow grub unnerved her in a way that, until that very moment, nothing else had. Every muscle in her body seemed to burn and tingle, and she felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee, to put as much distance between herself and the creature as she could, for there seemed to be something profoundly wrong about the burrow grub. It did not move as it should, and its obscene little mouth reminded her of a child's, and the sound it made, the horrible, horrible sound, elicited a primal loathing within her. The burrow grub paused by her elbow. Scree scree. Then its fat, limbless body contracted, and it hopped 4-5 inches straight up into the air and then dove headfirst toward the inner part of her elbow. As it landed, the burrow grub divided into a dozen small, bright green centipedes, which swarmed over her arm before each chose a spot to sink its mandibles into her flesh and bore its way through her skin. The pain was too great for her to bear. She struggled against her restraints and screamed at the ceiling, but she could not escape her torment, not then and not for a seemingly endless span of time thereafter. The iron had hurt more, but she would have preferred its touch, for the hot metal was impersonal, inanimate, and predictable, all things the burrow grub was not. There was a special horror in knowing that the cause of her pain was a creature chewing on her, and worse, that it was inside her. At the last, she lost her pride and self-control and cried out to the goddess Gokukara for mercy, and then she began to babble as a child might, unable to stop the flow of random words coming from her mouth. And behind her, she heard Galbatorix laughing, and his enjoyment of her suffering made her hate him all the more. She blinked, slowly coming back to herself. After several moments, she realized that Murtaugh and Galbatorix were gone. She had no recollection of their departure. She must have lost consciousness. The pain was less than before, but she still hurt terribly. She glanced down her body, then averted her eyes, feeling her pulse quicken. Where the centipedes had been, she was not sure whether individually they were still considered burrow grubs. Her flesh was swollen and lines of purple blood filled the tracks they had left underneath the surface of her skin, and every track burned. It felt as if she had been lashed across the front of her body with a metal whip. She wondered if perhaps the burrow grubs were still inside of her, lying dormant while they digested their meal. Or perhaps they were metamorphosing, like maggots into flies, and they would turn into something even worse. Or, and this seemed the most terrible possibility, perhaps they were laying eggs within her, and more of them would soon hatch and begin to feast on her. She shuddered and cried out with fear and frustration. The wounds made it difficult for her to remain coherent. Her vision faded in and out, and she found herself weeping, which disgusted her, but she could not stop, no matter how hard she tried. As a distraction, she fell to talking to herself, nonsense mostly, anything to bolster her resolve or focus her mind on other subjects. It helped, if only a little. She knew that Galbatorix did not want to kill her, but she feared that in his anger he had gone further than he intended. She was shaking, and her entire body felt inflamed, as if she had been stung by hundreds of bees. Willpower could sustain her for only so long. No matter how determined she was, there was a limit to what her frame could withstand, and she felt that she was well past that point. Something deep inside her seemed to have broken, and she was no longer confident that she could recover from her injuries. The door to the chamber scraped open. She forced her eyes to focus as she strained to see who was approaching. It was Murtaugh. He looked down at her, his lips pinched, his nostrils flared, and a furrow between his brows. At first she thought he was angry, but then she realized he was actually worried and afraid, deathly so. The strength of his concern surprised her. She knew he regarded her with a certain liking. Why else would he have convinced Galbatorix to keep her alive? But she had not suspected that he cared for her quite so much. She tried to reassure him with a smile. It must not have come out right, for as she did, Murtaugh clenched his jaw, as if he was struggling to contain himself. "Try not to move,"
Well,
he said, and lifted his hands over her and began to murmur in the ancient language. As if I could, she thought. His magic soon took effect, and wound by wound, her pain abated, but it did not disappear entirely. She frowned at him, puzzled, and he said, "I'm sorry. I can do no more. Galbatorix would know how, but it's beyond me." What about your Eldenari? She asked. Surely they can help. He shook his head. Young dragons all, or they were when their bodies died. They knew little of magic then, and Galbatorix has taught them almost nothing since. I'm sorry. Are those things still in me? No, they're not. Galbatorix removed them once you passed out. Her relief was profound. Your spell didn't stop the pain. She tried not to sound accusatory, but she could not prevent a note of anger from creeping into her voice. He grimaced. I'm not sure why. It ought to have. Whatever that creature is, it doesn't fit into the normal pattern of the world. Do you know where it's from? No, I only learned of it today, when Galbatorix fetched it from his inner chambers. She closed her eyes for a moment. Let me up. R.U.S. Let me up. Without a word, he undid her restraints. Then she got to her feet and stood swaying next to the slab while she waited for an attack of lightheadedness to recede. Here, said Murtaugh, handing her his cape. She wrapped it around her body, covering herself for both modesty and warmth, and also so that she did not have to look at the burns, scabs, blisters, and blood-filled lines that disfigured her.
Let's begin the transfiguration.
Limping, for, among other places, the burrow grub had visited the soles of her feet. She walked to the edge of the chamber. She leaned against the wall and slowly lowered herself to the floor. Murtaugh joined her, and the two of them sat staring at the opposite wall. Despite herself, she began to cry. After a while, she felt him touch her shoulder, and she jerked away. She could not help it. He had hurt her more in the past few days than anyone else ever had, and though she knew he had not wanted to do it, she could not forget that it was he who had wielded the hot iron. Even so, when she saw how her reaction stung him, she relented and reached out and took his hand. He gave her fingers a gentle squeeze, then put his arm around her shoulders and drew her close. She resisted for a moment, then relaxed into his embrace and laid her head on his chest as she continued to cry, her quiet sobs echoing in the bare stone room. Some minutes later, she felt him move beneath her as he said, I'll find a way to free you, I swear. It's too late for Thorn and me, but not for you. As long as you don't pledge fealty to Galbatorix, there's still a chance I can spirit you out of Urubayan. She looked up at him and decided he meant what he said. How? She whispered. I haven't the slightest idea, he admitted with a roguish smile. But I will, whatever it takes. You have to promise me, though, that you won't give up, not until I've tried. Agreed. I don't think I can endure that thing again. If he puts it on me again, I'll give him whatever he wants. You won't have to. He doesn't intend to use the burrow grubs again. What does he intend? Murtaugh was silent for a minute more. He's decided to start manipulating what you see, hear, feel, and taste. If that doesn't work, then he'll attack your mind directly. You won't be able to resist him if he does. No one ever has. Before it comes to that, though, I'm sure I'll be able to rescue you. All you have to do is keep fighting for another few days. That's it, just another few days. How can I if I can't trust my senses? There is one sense he cannot feign. Murtaugh twisted to look at her more directly. Let me touch your mind. I won't try to read your thoughts. I only want you to know what my mind feels like, so you can recognize me in the future. She hesitated. She knew that this was a turning point. Either she would agree to trust him, or she would refuse and perhaps lose her only chance to avoid becoming Galbatorix's slave. Still, she remained wary of granting anyone access to her mind. Murtaugh could be trying to lull her into learning defenses so that he could more easily install himself in her consciousness. Or it might be that he hoped to glean some piece of information by eavesdropping on her thoughts. Then she thought, why should Galbatorix resort to such tricks? He could do either of those things himself. Murtaugh is right. I wouldn't be able to resist him. If I accept Murtaugh's offer, it may mean my doom, but if I refuse, my doom is inevitable. One way or another, Galbatorix will break me. It's only a matter of time. Do as you will, she said. Murtaugh nodded and half-closed his eyes. In the silence of her mind, she began to recite the scrap of verse she used whenever she wanted to hide her thoughts or defend her consciousness from an intruder. She concentrated on it with all her might, determined to repel Murtaugh if need be and also determined not to think about any of the secrets it was her duty to keep hidden. In El Harem, there lived a man with yellow eyes. To me, he said, beware the whispers, for they whisper lies. Do not wrestle with the demons of the dark, else upon your mind they'll place a mark. Do not listen to the shadows of the deep. else they haunt you even when you sleep. When Murtaugh's consciousness pressed against hers, she stiffened and began to recite the lines of the verse even faster. To her surprise, his mind felt familiar. The similarities between his consciousness and, no, she could not say whose, but the similarities were striking, as were the equally prominent differences. Foremost among the differences was his anger, which lay at the center of his being like a cold black heart, clenched and unmoving, with veins of hatred snaking out to entangle the rest of his mind. But his concern for her outshone his anger. Seeing it convinced her that his solicitude was genuine, for to dissemble with one's inner self was incredibly difficult, and she did not believe that Murtaugh could have deceived her so convincingly. True to his word, he made no attempt to force himself deeper into her mind, and after a few seconds, he withdrew and she again found herself alone with her thoughts. Murtaugh's eyes opened fully, and he said, "There now. Will you be able to recognize me if I reach out to you again?" She nodded. Good. Galbatorix can do many things, but even he cannot imitate the feeling of another person's mind. I'll try to warn you before he starts to alter your senses, and I'll contact you when he stops. That way, he won't be able to confuse you as to what is real and what is not. Thank you, she said, unable to express the full extent of her gratitude in so short a phrase. Fortunately, we have some time. The Varden are only 3 days hence, and the elves are fast approaching from the north. Galbatorix has gone to oversee the final placement of Urubayan's defenses and to discuss strategy with Lord Barst, who has command of the army now that it's garrisoned here in the city. She frowned. That boded ill. She had heard of Lord Barst. He had a fearsome reputation among the nobles of Galbatorix's court. He was said to be both keen-minded and bloody-handed, and those who were foolish enough to oppose him, he crushed without mercy. Not you? She asked. Galbatorix has other plans for me, although he's yet to share them. How long will he be busy with his preparations? The rest of today and all of tomorrow. Do you think you can free me before he returns? I don't know. Probably not. A pause fell between them. Then he said, "Now I have a question for you. Why did you kill those men? You knew you wouldn't make it out of the citadel. Was it just to spite Galbatorix, as he said?" She sighed and pushed herself off Murtaugh's chest as she was sitting upright. With some reluctance, he released his hold around her shoulders. She sniffed, then looked him square in the eyes. "I couldn't just lie there and let him do whatever he wanted to. I had to fight back. I had to show him that he hadn't broken me, and I wanted to hurt him however I could." So it was spite. In part. What of it? She expected him to express disgust or condemnation in her actions, but instead he gave her a frozen look and his lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "Then I say well done," he replied. After a moment, she returned his smile. "Besides," she said, "there was always a chance I might escape." He snorted. "Dragons might start eating grass. Even so, I had to try. I understand. If I could have, I would have done the same when the twins first brought me here. And now? I still can't, and even if I could, what purpose would it serve?" To that, she had no answer. Silence followed, and then she said, "Murtaugh, if it's not possible to free me from here, then I want your promise that you'll help me escape by other means. I wouldn't ask, I wouldn't place this burden upon you, but your assistance would make the task easier, and I may not have the opportunity to do it myself." His lips grew thin and hard as she spoke, but he did not interrupt. "Whatever happens, I won't allow myself to become a plaything for Galbatorix to order about as he will. I'll do anything at all to avoid that fate. Can you understand that?" His chin dipped in a short nod. "Then do I have your word?" He looked down and clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. "You do." Murtaugh was tacit, but eventually she succeeded in drawing him out again, and they passed the time talking about matters of little import. Murtaugh told her of the alterations he had made to the saddle Galbatorix had given him for Thorn, changes that Murtaugh was justifiably proud of, as they allowed him to mount and dismount faster, as well as to draw his sword with less inconvenience. She told him about the market streets in Aberon, the capital of Serta, and how, as a child, she had often run away from her nurse to explore them. Her favorite of the merchants had been a man of the wandering tribes. His name was Hadamanar and no Dachu Tagana, but he had insisted that she call him by his familiar name, which was Tagana. He sold knives and daggers, and he always seemed to delight in showing them his wares, even though she didn't draw any. As she and Murtaugh continued to talk, their conversation grew easier and more relaxed. Despite their unpleasant circumstances, she found that she enjoyed speaking with him. He was smart and well-educated, and he had a mordant wit that she appreciated, especially given her current predicament. Murtaugh seemed to enjoy their conversation as much as she did. Still, the time came when they both recognized that it would be foolish to keep talking, for fear of being caught. So she returned to the slab, where she lay down and allowed him to strap her to the unforgiving block of stone once again. As he was about to leave, she said, "Murtaugh." He paused and turned to regard her. She hesitated for a moment, then mustered her courage and said, "Why?" She thought he understood her meaning. Why her? Why save her, and then why do the rescue? She had guessed at the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it. He stared at her for the longest while, and then, in a low, hard voice, he said, "You know why." Amid the ruins, the thick gray clouds parted, and from his place on Saphira's back, Aragon beheld the interior of Vroingard Island. Before them was a huge bowl-shaped valley, encircled by the steep hill they could see curving through the tops of the clouds. A dense forest of spruce and fir trees blanketed the sides of the mountains as well as the foothills below, like an army of prickly soldiers marching down from the peaks. The trees were tall and mournful, and even from a distance Aragon could see the beards of moss and lichen that hung from their heavy branches. Scraps of white mist clung to the sides of the mountains, and in several places throughout the valley, diffuse curtains of rain drifted from the ceiling of clouds. High above the valley floor, Aragon could see a number of stone structures among the trees, tumbled, overgrown entrances to caves, the husks of burnt-out towers, great walls with collapsed roofs, and a few smaller buildings that looked as if they might still be habitable. A dozen or more rivers flowed out of the mountains and wandered across the verdant ground until they poured into a large, still lake near the center of the valley. Around the lake lay the remnants of the riders' city, Doro Areva. The buildings were immense, great empty halls of such enormous proportions that many could have encompassed the whole of Cargamol. Every door was like the mouth to a vast, unexplored cavern. Every window was as tall and wide as a castle gate, and every wall was a sheer cliff. Thick mats of ivy strangled the blocks of stone, and across the ivy there was moss, which meant that the buildings blended into the landscape and looked as if they had grown out of the earth itself. What little of the stone was bare tended to be of pale ochre, although patches of red, and dusky wood were also visible. As with all well-made structures, the buildings were graceful and flowing and more attenuated than those of dwarves or humans. But they also possessed a solidity and authority that the tree houses of Elsmere lacked. In some of them, Aragon described similarities to houses in Palanquer Valley, and he remembered that the earliest human riders had come from that very part of the The result was a unique style of architecture, neither entirely elvish nor entirely human. Almost all the buildings were damaged, some more severely than others. The damage seemed to radiate outward from a single point near the southern edge of the city, where a wide crater sank more than 30 feet into the ground. A copse of birch trees had taken root in the depression, and their silvery leaves shook in the gusts of the directionless breeze. The open areas within the city were overgrown with weeds and brush, while a fringe of grass surrounded each of the flagstones that formed the streets. Where the buildings had sheltered the riders' gardens from the blast that had ravaged the city, dull-colored flowers still grew in artful designs, their shapes no doubt governed by the dictates of some long-forgotten spell. Altogether, the circular valley presented a dismal picture. "Behold the ruins of our pride and glory," said Gladder. Then, "Aragon, you must cast another spell." The wording of it goes thus, and he uttered several lines in the ancient language. It was an odd spell, the phrasing was obscure and convoluted, and Aragon was unable to determine what it was supposed to accomplish. When he asked Gladder, the old dragon said, "There is an invisible poison here, in the air you breathe, in the ground you walk upon, and in the food you may eat and the water you may drink. The spell will protect us against it." "What poison?" asked Saphira, her thoughts as slow as the beats of her wings. Aragon saw from Gladder an image of the crater by the city, and the dragon said, "During the battle with the Forsworn, one of our own, an elf by the name of Thuviel, killed himself with magic. Whether by design or by accident has never been clear, but the result is what you see and what you cannot see, for the resulting explosion rendered the area unfit to live in. Those who remained here soon developed lesions upon their skin and lost their hair, and many died thereafter." Concerned, Aragon cast the spell, which required little energy, before he said, "How could any one person, elf or not, cause so much damage? Even if Lumiel's dragon helped him. I can't think how it could be possible, not unless his dragon was the size of a mountain. His dragon did not help him, said Gladder. His dragon was dead. No, Lumiel brought this destruction by himself. But how? The only way he could have. He converted his flesh into energy. He made himself into a spirit? No, the energy was without thought or structure, and once unbound, it raced outward until it dispersed. I had not realized that a single body contains so much force. It is not well known, but even the smallest spark of matter is equal to a great amount of energy. Matter, it seems, is merely frozen energy. Melt it, and the release of blood few can withstand. It was said that the explosion here was heard as far away as Tyr, and that the cloud of smoke that followed rose as high as the Bior Mountains. Was it the blast that killed Glaerun? Aragon asked, referring to the one member of the Forsworn who he knew had died on Vroingard. It was. Galbatorix and the rest of the Forsworn had a moment of warning, and so were able to shield themselves, but many of our own were not as fortunate and thus perished. As Saphira glided downward from the underside of the low-slung clouds, Gladder instructed her where to fly, so she altered her course, turning toward the northwestern part of the valley. Gladder named each of the mountains that she flew past, Iltheros, Felsverd, and Namenmast, along with Wuldrum and Turnadrum. He also named many of the holds and fallen towers below, and he gave something of their history to Aragon and Saphira, although only Aragon paid heed to the old dragon's narration. Within Gladder's consciousness, Aragon felt an ancient sorrow reawaken. The sorrow was not so much for the destruction of Arthurian as for the deaths of the riders, the near extinction of the dragons, and the loss of thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom. The memory of what had been, of the companionship he had once shared with the other members of his order, exacerbated Gladder's loneliness. That, along with his sorrow, created a mood of such desolation. Aragon began to feel saddened as well. He withdrew slightly from Gladder, but still the valley seemed gloomy and melancholy, as if the land itself were mourning the fall of the waters. The lower Saphira grew, the larger the buildings appeared. As their true size became evident, Aragon realized that what he had read in Domia Abr Werda was no exaggeration. As the land was so enormous, Saphira would be able to fly within them. Near the edge of the abandoned city, he began to notice piles of giant white bones upon the ground, the skeletons of dragons. The sight filled him with revulsion, and yet he could not bring himself to look elsewhere. What struck him most was their size. A few of the dragons had been smaller than Saphira, but most had been far larger. The biggest he saw was a skeleton with ribs that he guessed were at least 80 feet long and perhaps 15 wide at their thickest. The skull alone, a huge, fierce thing covered with blotches of lichen, like a rough crag of stone, was longer and taller than the main part of Saphira's body. Even Gladder, when he was still clothed in flesh, would have appeared diminutive next to the slain dragon. There lies Belgabad, greatest of us all, said Gladder as he noticed the object of Aragon's attention. Aragon vaguely remembered the name from one of the histories he had read in Elsmera. The author had written only that Belgabad had been present at the battle and that he perished in the fighting, as so many had. Who was his rider? He asked. He had no rider. He was a wild dragon. For centuries, he lived alone in the icy reaches of the north, but when Galbatorix and the Forsworn began to slaughter our kind, he flew to our aid. Was he the largest dragon ever? No. But at the time, yes. How did he find enough to eat? At that age and at that size, dragons spend most of their time in a sleep-like trance, dreaming of whatever happens to capture their hands, be it the turning of the stars, or the rise and fall of the mountains over the Aeons, or even something as small as the motion of a butterfly's wings. Already I feel the lure of such powers, but awake I am needed and awake I shall stay. Did you know Belgabad? Asked Saphira, forcing the words through her fatigue. I met him, but I did not know him. Wild dragons did not, as a rule, consort with those of us who were bonded with riders. They looked down on us for being too tame and too compliant, while we looked down on them for being too driven by their instincts, although sometimes we admired them for the same. Also, you must remember, they had no language of their own, and that created a greater difference between us than you might think. Language alters your mind in ways that are hard to explain. Wild dragons can communicate as effectively as any dwarf or elf, of course, but they did so by sharing memories, images, and sensations, not words. Only the more cunning of them chose to learn this or any other tongue. Ladder paused, and then he added, if I recall correctly, Belgabad was a distant ancestor of Rogmar the Black, and Rogmar, as I'm sure you remember, Saphira, was the great-great-great-grandsire of your mother, Berbada. In her exhaustion, Saphira was slow to react, but at last she twisted her neck to again look at the vast skeleton. He must have been a good hunter to grow so big. He was the very best, said Ladder. Then, I am glad to be of his blood. The number of bones scattered across the ground staggered Aragon. Until then, he had fully comprehended the extent of the power how many dragons there had once been. The sight renewed his hate for Galbatorix, and once again Aragon swore that he would see the king dead. Saphira sank through a band of mist, the white haze rolling off the tips of her wings like tiny whirlpools set within the sky. Then a field of tangled grass rushed up to her and she landed with a heavy jolt. Her right foreleg gave way beneath her, and she lurched to the side and fell on her chest and shoulder, plowing into the ground with such force that Aragon could have thrown himself on the next spike had it not been for his horns. Once her forward slide ceased, Saphira lay motionless, stunned by the impact. Then she slowly rolled her and settled into a low crouch. The spokes on the saddle creaked as she moved, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere that pervaded the interior of the island. Aragon pulled loose the bands around his legs, then gently activated the crowd. It was wet and soft, and he clapped her one knee as his boots sank into the damp earth. We made it, he said, amazed. He walked forward to Saphira's head, and when she lowered her neck so that she could look him in the eye, he placed his hands on either side of her long head and pressed his forehead against her snout. Thank you, he said. He heard the snick as her eyelids closed, and then her head began to vibrate as she hummed deep in her chest. After a moment, Aragon released her and turned to look at their surroundings. The field Saphira had landed in was on the northern outskirts of the city. Pieces of cracked masonry, some as large as Saphira herself, lay scattered throughout the grass. Aragon was relieved she had avoided striking any. The field sloped upward, away from the city, to the base of the nearest foothill, which was covered with forest. Where field and hill met, a large paved square had been cut flat from the ground, and at the far side of the square sat a massive pile of dressed stone that stretched to the north for over half a mile. Intact, the building would have been one of the largest on the island, and certainly one of the most ornate, for among the square blocks of stone that had formed the walls, Aragon spotted dozens of crooked pillars, as well as carved panels depicting vines and flowers, and a whole host of statues, most of which were missing some combination of body parts, as if they too had participated in the battle. There lies the great library, said Ladder, or what remains after Galbatorix plundered it. Aragon slowly turned as he inspected the surrounding area. To the south of the library, he saw the faint lines of abandoned footpaths underneath the shaggy pelt of grass. The paths led away from the library to a grove of apple trees that hid the ground from view, but rising behind the trees was a jagged spar of stone well over 200 feet tall, upon which grew several gnarled junipers. A spark of excitement formed within Aragon's chest. He was sure, but still he asked, is that it? Is that the rock of Puthian? He could feel Ladder using his eyes to look at the formation, and then the dragon said, it seems oddly familiar, but I cannot remember when I might have seen it before. Ellipsis. Aragon needed no other confirmation. Come on, he said. He waded through the waist-high grass toward the nearest path. There the grass was not quite so thick, and he could feel hard cobblestones under his feet instead of rain soil. With Saphira close behind, he hurried down the path, and together they walked through the shadows of the apple trees. Both of them stepped with care, for the trees seemed alert and watchful, and something about the shape of their branches was unnerving, as if the trees were waiting to ensnare them with splintered claws. Without meaning to, Aragon breathed a sigh of relief when they emerged from the grove. He stood upon the edge of a large clearing wherein grew a tangled pool of roses, thistles, raspberries, and water hemlock. Stone prominence stood a row of drooping fir trees, just all the way back to the mountain that loomed high above. The angry chatter of squirrels echoed among the boles of the forest, but of the animals themselves, not so much as a whisker was to be seen. 3 stone benches, their shapes half hidden beneath layers of roots, vines, and creepers, were situated at equal distances around the clearing. Off to the side was a willow tree, whose latticework trunk had once served as a bower where the riders might sit and enjoy the view, but in the past 100 years, the trunk had grown too thick for any man, elf, or dwarf to slip into the space within. Aragon stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared at the rock of Kuthian. Beside him, Saphira woofed and dropped onto her belly, shaking the ground and causing him to bend his knees to keep his balance. He rubbed her on the shoulder, then turned his gaze back to the tower of rock. A sense of nervous anticipation welled up inside him. Opening his mind, Aragon searched the clearing and the trees beyond for anyone who might be waiting to ambush them. The only living things he sensed were plants, insects, and the moles, mice, and garter snakes that lived among the brush in the clearing. Then he started to memorize the spells that he hoped would allow him to detect any magical traps in the area. Before he had put more than a few words together, Bladder said, "Stop. You and Saphira are too tired for this now. Rest first. Tomorrow we can return and see what remains have found. But the two of you are in no condition to defend yourselves if we must fight. Whatever we are supposed to find is still in you." Aragon hesitated, then reluctantly made the spell. He knew Bladder was right, but he hated to wait any longer when the completion of their quest was so close at hand. "Very well," he said, and climbed back onto Saphira. With a weary huff, she rose to her feet, then slowly turned around and trudged once more through the valley trees. The heavy impact of her steps shook loose withered leaves from the canopy, one of which landed in Aragon's lap. He picked it up and was about to turn it away when he noticed that the leaf was shaped differently than it ought to be. The teeth along the edge were longer and wider than those of any apple leaf he had seen before, and the veins formed seemingly random patterns, instead of the regular network of lines he would have expected. He picked another leaf, this one still green. Like its desiccated cousin, the fresh leaf had larger serrations and a confused map of veins. "Ever since the battle, things here have not been as they once were," said Bladder. Aragon frowned and tossed away the leaves. Again he heard the chatter of the squirrels, and again he failed to see any among the trees, nor was he able to feel them with his mind, which concerned him. "If I had scales, this place would make them itch," he said to Saphira. A small puff of smoke rose from her nostrils as she snorted with amusement. From the grove, she walked south until she came to one of the many streams that flowed out of the mountains, a thin white brook that burbled softly as it tumbled over its bed of rocks. There Saphira turned and followed the water upstream to a sheltered meadow near the forefront of the evergreen forest. "Here," said Saphira, and she sank to the ground. It looked a good place to make camp, and Saphira was in no condition to keep searching, so in this mountain. He paused for a moment to appreciate the view over the valley, then he removed the saddle and the saddlebags from Saphira, whereupon she shook her head, rolled her shoulders, and then twisted her neck to nibble at a spot on the side of her chest where the straps had been chafing. Without further ado, she curled up in the grass, tucked her head under her wing, and wrapped her tail around herself. "Do not wake me unless something is trying to eat us," she said. Aragon smiled and patted her on the tail, then turned to look at the valley again. He stood there for a long while, barely thinking, content to observe and exist without making any effort to coax meaning from the world around him. At last he fetched his bedroll, which he laid out beside Saphira. "Will you keep watch for us?" he asked Bladder. "I shall keep watch. Rest, and do not worry." Aragon nodded, even though Bladder could not see him, and then he lowered himself onto the blankets and allowed himself to drift off into the embrace of his waking dreams. Snugly for two. It was late afternoon when Aragon opened his eyes. The blanket of clouds had broken in several places, and beams of golden light planked the valley floor, illuminating the tops of the ruined buildings. Though the valley still looked cold and wet and unwelcoming, the light gave it a newfound majesty. For the first time, Aragon understood why the riders had chosen to settle on the island. He yawned, then glanced over at Saphira and lightly touched her mind. She was still asleep, lost in a dreamless slumber. Her consciousness was like a flame that had dimmed until it was little more than a smoldering coal, a coal that might just as easily go out as flare up again. The feeling unsettled him. It reminded him too much of death, so he returned to his own mind and restricted their contact to a narrow thread of thought, just enough so that he could be sure of her safety. In the forest behind him, a pair of squirrels began to swear at each other with a series of high-pitched shrieks. He frowned as he listened. Their voices sounded a bit too sharp, a bit too fast, a bit too warbly. It was as if some other creature was imitating the cries of the squirrels. The thought made his scalp prickle. He lay where he was for over an hour, listening to the shrieks and chattering that emanated from the patterns of light as they played across the fields and mountains of the bowl-shaped valley. trees, painting them white. Aragon rose and said to Gladder, "I'm going to gather some firewood. I'll be back in a few minutes." The dragon acknowledged him, and Aragon carefully made his way across the meadow to the forest. It was best to be quiet so as not to disturb Saphira. Once he was at the trees, he quickened his pace. Although there were plenty of dead branches along the verge of the forest, he wanted to stretch his legs and, if he could, find the source of the chattering. Shadows lay heavy under the trees. The air was cool and still, like that of a cave deep underground, and it smelled of fungus, rotting wood, and oozing sap. The moss and lichen that trailed from the branches were like lengths of tattered lace, stained and sodden but still possessed a certain delicate beauty. They partitioned the interior of the woods into cells of different sizes, which made it difficult to see more than 50 feet in any direction. Aragon used the burbling of the brook to determine his bearings as he worked his way deeper into the forest. Now that he was close to them, he saw that the evergreens were unlike those from the Spine or even from New Weldenbarden. They had clusters of 7 needles instead of 3, and though it might have been a trick of the fading light, it seemed to him as if darkness clung to the trees, like a cloak wrapped around their trunks and branches. Also, everything about the trees, from the cracks in the bark to their protruding ends to their scaled cones, everything about them had a peculiar angularity and a fierceness of mind that made them appear as if they were about to pull themselves free of the earth and stride down the city below. Aragon shivered and loosened Brisinger in its scabbard. He had never before been in a forest that felt so menacing. It was as if the trees were angry, as did the apple grove earlier, as if they wanted to reach out and rend his flesh from his bones. With the back of his hand, he pushed aside a swath of yellow lichen as he cautiously made his way forward. So far he had seen no sign of game, nor had he found any evidence of wolves or bears, which puzzled him. That close to the stream, there should have been trails leading to the water. Maybe the animals avoid this part of the woods, he thought. But why? A fallen log lay across his path. He stepped over it, and his boot sank ankle deep into a carpet of moss. An instant later, the Gedvi Ignatia on his palm began to itch, and he heard a tiny chorus of scree-scree and scree-scraw, as a half-dozen white, worm-like grubs, each the size of one of his thumbs, burst out of the moss and began to hop away from him. Bold instincts took hold, and he stopped as he would if he had chanced upon a snake. He did not blink. He did not even blink as he watched the fat, obscene-looking grubs flee. At the same time, he racked his memory for any mention of them during his training in Ellsworth. No such thing. Gladder, what are these? And he showed the dragon the grubs. What is their name in the ancient language? To Aragon's dismay, Gladder said, "They are unknown to me. I have not seen their like before, nor have I ever heard tell of them. They are new to Vroingard, and new to Alagesa. Do not let them touch you. They may be more dangerous than they appear." Once they had put several feet between them and Aragon, the nameless grubs hopped higher than usual and with a scree-scrow dove back into the moss. As they landed, they split, dividing into a swarm of rings and tentacles, which quickly disappeared within the tangled strands of moss. Aragon allowed himself to breathe. They should not be able to see Gladder. He sounded trouble. Aragon slowly lifted his boot off the moss and retreated behind the log. Examining the moss with greater care, he saw that what he had originally taken as the tips of old branches poking out of the blanket of vegetation were actually pieces of broken ribs and antlers, the remains, he thought, of one or more deer. After a moment's consideration, Aragon turned around and began to retrace his steps, this time making sure to avoid every scrap of moss along the way, which was no easy task. Whatever had been chattering in the forest was not the first thing his life to find, especially since he suspected that there was worse than the grubs lurking among the trees. His palm kept itching, and from experience, he knew that meant there was still something dangerous close by. When he could see the meadow and the blue of Saphira's scales between the trunks of the evergreens, he turned aside and walked to the brook. Moss covered the bank of the stream, so he stepped from rock to stone until he was standing on a flat-topped rock in the midst of the water. There he squatted, removed his gloves, and washed his hands, face, and neck. The touch of the icy water was bracing, and in moments his ears flushed and his whole body began to feel warm. A loud chattering rang forth over the stream as he wiped the last few droplets from his neck. Moving as little as possible, he looked toward the top of the trees on the opposite bank. 30 feet up, 4 shadows sat on a branch. The shadows had large barbed plumes that extended in every direction from the black ovals of their heads. A pair of white eyes, slanted and slit-like, glowed within the middle of each oval, and the blankness of their gaze made it impossible to determine where they were looking. Most disconcerting yet, the shadows, like all shadows, had no depth. When they turned to the side, they disappeared. Without taking his eyes off them, Aragon reached across his body and grasped Risinger's hilt. The leftmost shadow ruffled its plumes and then uttered the same shrieking chatter he had mistaken for a squirrel. 2 more of the wraiths did likewise, and the forest echoed with the strident clamor of their cries. Aragon considered trying to touch their minds, but remembering the fangir on his way to Elsmera, he discarded the idea as foolhardy. In a low voice, he said, Akai Frikai Unshurtigal, I am a rider and a friend. The shadows seemed to fix their glowing eyes upon him, and for a moment, all was silent, save the gentle murmuring of the brook. Then they began to chatter again, and their eyes increased in brightness until they were like pieces of white-hot iron. When, after several minutes, the shadows had made no move to attack him and, moreover, showed no indication of departing, Aragon rose to his feet and carefully reached out with one foot toward the stone behind him. The motion seemed to alarm the wraiths. They shrieked in unison. Then they shrugged and shook themselves, and in their place appeared 4 large owls, with the same barbed plumes surrounding their mottled faces. They opened their yellow beaks and chattered at him, scolding him even as squirrels might. Then they took wing and flew silently off into the trees and soon vanished behind a screen of heavy boughs. Barzel, said Aragon. He jumped back the way he had come and hurried to the meadow, stopping only to pick up an armful of fallen branches. As soon as he reached Saphira, he placed the wood on the ground, knelt, and began to cast wards, as many as he could think of. Bladder recommended a spell that he had overlooked, then said, None of these creatures are here and Oromans after the battle. They are not as they should be. The magic that was cast here has twisted the land and those who live on it. This is an evil place now. What creatures? Asked Saphira. She opened her eyes and yawned, an intimidating sight. Aragon shared his memories with her, and she said, You should have brought me with you. I could have eaten the grubs and the shadow birds, and then you would have had nothing to fear from them. Saphira. She rolled an eye at him. I'm hungry. Magic or not, is there any reason I should not eat these strange things? Because they might eat you instead, Saphira Bjartskiller, said Gladder. You know the first law of hunting as well as I. Do not stalk your prey until you are sure that it is prey. Otherwise, you might well end up as a meal for something else. I wouldn't bother looking for deer either, said Aragon. I doubt there are many left. Besides, it's almost dark, and even if it weren't, I'm not sure hunting here would be safe. She growled softly. Very well, then I shall keep sleeping. But in the morning, I shall hunt, no matter the danger. My belly is empty, and I must eat before crossing the sea again. True to her word, Saphira closed her eyes and promptly returned to sleep. Aragon built a small fire, then ate a meager supper and watched the valley grow black. He and Gladder talked about their plans for the following day, and Gladder told him more about the history of the island, going back to the time before the elves had arrived in Elegesia, when Vroingard had been the province of the dragons alone. Before the last of the light had faded from the sky, the old dragon said, Would you like to see Vroingard as it was during the Age of the Riders? I would, said Aragon. Then look, said Gladder, and Aragon felt the dragon take hold of his mind and into it pour a stream of images and sensations. Aragon's vision shifted, and atop the landscape, he beheld a ghostly twin of the valley. The memory was of a valley in twilight, even as it was at the present, but the sky was free of clouds, and a multitude of stars shone twinkling and gleaming over the great ring of fire mountains, Aris Thelduin. The trees of long ago appeared taller, straighter, and less foreboding, and throughout the valley, the riders' buildings stood intact, glowing like pale beacons in the dusk with the soft light from the elves' flameless lanterns. Less ivy and moss covered the ochre stone then, and the halls and towers seemed noble in a way that the ruins did not. And along the cobblestone pathways and high overhead, Aragon discerned the glittering shapes of numerous dragons, graceful giants with the treasure of 1,000 years upon their hides. The apparition lasted for a moment longer, then Gladder released Aragon's mind, and the valley once more appeared as it was. It was beautiful, said Aragon. That it was, but no more. Aragon continued to study the valley, comparing it to what Gladder had shown him, and he frowned when he saw a line of bobbing lights, lanterns. He thought, Elven city. He whispered a spell to sharpen his sight and was able to make out a line of hooded figures in dark robes walking slowly through the ruins. They seemed solemn and unearthly, and there was a ritualistic quality to the measured beats of their strides and to the patterned sway of their lanterns. "Who are they?" he asked Bladder. He felt as if he was witnessing something not meant for others to see. "I do not know. Perhaps they are the descendants of those who hid during the battle. Perhaps they are men of your race who thought to settle here after the fall of the riders. Or perhaps they are those who worship dragons and riders as gods. Are there really such?" There were. We discouraged it, but even so, it was common in many of the more isolated parts of Elegesia. "It is good, I think, that you placed the place you did." Aragon watched as the hooded figures wound their way across the city, which took almost an hour. Once they arrived at the far side, the lanterns winked out one by one, and where the lantern holders had gone, Aragon could not see, even with the assistance of magic. Then Aragon banked the fire with handfuls of dirt and crawled under his blankets to rest. "Aragon, Saphira, rouse yourselves." Aragon's eyes snapped open. He sat upright and grabbed rising. All was dark, save for the dull red glow of the bed of coals to his right and a ragged patch of starry sky off to the east. Though the light was faint, Aragon was able to make out the general shape of the forest and the meadow, and the monstrously large snail that was sliding across the grass toward him. Aragon yelped and scrambled backward. The snail, whose shell was over 5 feet tall, hesitated, then slid, as fast as it could. The snake like this came through a half slit in his mouth, its head and eyeballs were each the size of his fist. Aragon realized that he would not have time to get to his feet, and on his back he did not have the space he needed to draw Reisinger. He prepared to cast a spell, but before he could, Saphira's head arrowed past him and she caught the snail about the middle with her jaws. The snail's shell cracked between her fangs with a sound like breaking slate, and the creature uttered a faint, quavering shriek. With a twist of her neck, Saphira tossed the snail into the air, opened her mouth as wide as it would go, and swallowed the creature whole, bobbing her head twice as she did, like a robin. Lowering his gaze, Aragon saw 4 more giant snails further down upon the rise. One of the creatures had retreated within its shell, the others were hurrying away upon their undulating, skirt-like bellies. "Over there," shouted Aragon. Saphira leapt forward. Her entire body left the ground for a moment, and then she landed upon all fours and snapped up first 1, then 2, then 3 of the snails. She did not eat the last snail, the one hiding in its shell, but drew back her head and bathed it in a stream of blue and yellow flame that lit up the land for hundreds of feet in every direction. She maintained the flame for no more than a second or 2, then she picked up the smoking, steaming snail between her jaws, as gently as a mother cat picking up a baby, carried it over to Aragon, and dropped it at his feet. He eyed it with distrust, but it appeared well and truly dead. "Now you can have a proper breakfast," said Saphira. He stared at her, then began to laugh, and he kept laughing until he was doubled over, resting his hands on his knees and heaving for breath. "What is so amusing?" she asked, and sniffed the soot-blackened shell. "Yes, why do you laugh, Aragon?" asked Bladder. He shook his head and continued to wheeze. At last he was able to say, "Because," and then he shifted to speaking with his mind so that Bladder would hear as well. "Because, snail and eggs." And he began to giggle again, feeling very silly. "Because, snail states. On the stalk, feeling tired, eat an eyeball. Who needs meat when you have slime? I could put the stalks in a cup, like a bunch of flowers, and they would..." He was laughing so hard, he found it impossible to continue, and he dropped to one knee while he gasped again, tears of mirth streaming from his eyes. Saphira opened her jaws in a toothy approximation of a smile, and she made a soft choking sound in her throat. "You're very odd sometimes, Aragon." Feels very indicating. She sniffed the shell again. "Some meat would be nice." "At least you ate," he said, both with his mind and his tongue. "Not enough, but enough to return to a bargain." As his laughter subsided, Aragon poked at the snail with the tip of his boot. "It's been so long since there were dragons on Groingar, it must not have realized what you thought to make an easy meal of me.
Seems to me
That would have been a sorry death
it's enough to
indeed,
make a
to
man
end up his
sick."
dinner for a snail." "Good," said Saphira. "But memorable," he agreed, feeling his mirth return. "And what did I say is the first law of hunting, younglings?" Together Aragon and Saphira non-stop. riders, the dragons, and the Forsworn loosed an enormous amount of energy during the conflict. Much of it was bound in spells, but much of it was not. Those who lived to tell of it said that, for a time, the world went mad and nothing they saw or heard could be trusted. Some of that energy must have settled on the ancestors of the grubs and the birds you saw today and altered them. However, you are mistaken to include the snails among their ranks. The Snaugli, as they are known, have always lived here on Broingard. They were a favorite food of ours, of the dragons, for reasons I'm sure, Saphira, you understand. She humped and licked her chops. And not only is their flesh soft and tasty, but the shells are good for the digestion. If they're just ordinary animals, then why didn't my ward stop them? Asked Aragon. At the very least, I should have been warned of approaching danger. That, replied Gladder, may be a result of the battle. Magic did not create the Snaugli, but that does not mean they have remained unaffected by the forces that have racked this place. We should not linger here any longer than necessary. Better we leave before whatever else is lurking on the island decides to test our mettle. With Saphira's help, Aragon cracked open the shell of the burnt snail and, by the glow of a red wearlight, cleaned the spineless carcass within, which was a messy, slimy exercise that left him covered in gore up to his elbows. Then Aragon had Saphira bury the meat close to the bed of coals. Afterward, Saphira returned to the spot in the grass where she had been lying, curled up once again, and went to sleep. This time Aragon joined her, carrying his blankets and the saddlebags, one of which contained the mother's and there he spent the rest of the night, thinking and dreaming. The following day was as gray and gloomy as the previous one. A light dusting of snow covered the sides of the mountains and the tops of the foothills, and the air had a chill that led Aragon to believe it would snow again later that day. Tired as she was, Saphira did not stir until the sun was already a hand's breadth above the mountains. Aragon was impatient, but he let her sleep. It was more important for her to prepare for the flight to Groingard than for them to get an early start. Once she was awake, Saphira dug up the snail carcass for him, and he took the large breakfast of snail, but he was unsure what to call it, snail bacon. Whatever the name for it, the strips of meat were delicious, and he ate more than he usually would. Saphira devoured what was left, and then they waited an hour, for it would not be wise to enter a fight with food in their stomachs. Finally, Aragon rolled up his blankets and strapped the saddle back onto Saphira, and together with Gladder they set off for the Rock of Kuthian. The walk to the apple grove seemed shorter than it had the previous day. The gnarled trees were as ominous as ever, and Aragon kept his hand on Brisinger the whole time they were in the thicket. As before, Saphira stopped at the edge of the naked clearing that fronted the Rock of Kuthian. A flock of crows was perched upon the rough crag of stone, and at the sight of Saphira, they rose cawing into the air, as ill an omen as Aragon could imagine. For half an hour, Aragon stood fixed in place as he cast spell after spell, searching for any magic that could cause him, Saphira, or Gladder harm. Both were around the clearing, the Rock of Kuthian, and, so far as he could tell, he found it not to create enchantment. Some of the spells embedded in the depths of the earth had such power that it felt as if a great river of energy was flowing beneath his feet. Others were small and seemingly innocuous, sometimes affecting only a single flower or a single branch of a tree. More than half of the enchantments were dormant, because they lacked energy, no longer had an object upon which to act, or were waiting for a certain set of circumstances that had yet to arrive, and a number of the spells seemed to conflict, as if the writers, or whoever had cast them, had sought to modify or negate earlier pieces of magic. Aragon was unable to determine the purpose of most of the spells. No record remained of the words used to cast them, only the structures of energy that the long-dead magicians had so carefully created, and those structures were difficult, if not impossible, to interpret. Gladder was of some help, as he was familiar with many of the based on Groingard, but otherwise Aragon was forced to guess. Fortunately, even though he could not always figure out what a spell was supposed to do, he was often able to establish whether it would affect him, Saphira, or Gladder. It was a complicated process that required complicated incantations, though, and it took him another hour to examine all the spells. What most worried him, and Gladder as well, were the spells that he might not have been able to detect. Ferreting out other magicians' enchantments grew vastly more difficult if they had tried to hide their work. At last, when Aragon was as confident as he could be that the around the Rock of lichen-covered spire. Aragon tilted his head back and looked at the location. It seemed incredibly far away. He saw nothing unusual about the stone, nor did Saphira. "Let us say our names and be done with it," she said. Aragon sent a questioning thought to Gladder, and the Gladder responded, "She is right. There is no reason to delay. Speak your name, and Saphira and I shall do likewise." Feeling nervous, Aragon clenched his hands firmly, and unslung his shield from his back, rising to a crouch. "My name," he said in a loud, clear voice, "is Aragon Shadeslayer, son of Brahm. My name is Saphira Bjardskiller, daughter of Vervada. And mine Gladder Eldenari, son of Nithring, she of the long tail." They waited. Off in the distance, the crows cawed, as if mocking them. Unease stirred within Aragon, but he ignored it. He had not really expected opening the vault to be quite so simple. "Try again, but this time say your piece in the ancient language," advised Gladder. So Aragon said, "Nam Iet Aragon Sundaber Burgundy, Sanar Abr Brahm." And then Saphira repeated her name and lineage in the ancient language, as did Gladder. Again nothing happened. Aragon's unease deepened. If their trip had been in vain, no, it did not bear thinking about. "Not yet. Maybe all of our names have to be uttered out loud," he said. "How?" asked Saphira. "Am I supposed to roar at the stone? And what of Gladder?" "I can say your names for you," said Aragon. "It seems unlikely that is what is required, but we may as well attempt it," said Gladder. "In this or the ancient language?" "The ancient language, I would think, but try both to be certain." 2 times then Aragon recited their names, yet the stone remained as stolid and unchanging as ever. Finally, frustrated, he said, "Maybe we're in the wrong place. Maybe the entrance to the Vault of Souls is on the other side of the stone. Or maybe it's on the very top. If that were the case, wouldn't the directions contained within Domia Abr Werda have mentioned it?" asked Gladder. Aragon lowered his shield. "When are riddles ever easy to understand? What if only you were supposed to give your name?" Saphira said to Aragon. "Did not Solomon say, when all seems lost and your power is insufficient, go to the rock of Kuthian and speak your name to open the Vault of Souls? Your name, Aragon, not mine or Gladder's." Aragon frowned. "It's possible, I suppose. But if only my name is needed, then perhaps I have to be by myself when I say it." With a growl, Saphira leapt into the air, ruffling Aragon's hair and battering the plants in the clearing with the wind from her wings.
Welcome.
"Then try, and be quick about it,"
Very well.
she said as she flew east, away from the rock. When she was a quarter-mile away, Aragon looked back at the uneven surface of the rock, once more raised his shield,
Farewell,
and
good-
once more pronounced his name, first in his own tongue and then in that of the elves. No door or passageway revealed itself. No cracks or fissures appeared within the stone. No symbols traced themselves upon its surface. In every respect, the towering spire seemed to be nothing more than a solid piece of granite, devoid of any secrets. "Saphira," Aragon shouted with his mind. Then he swore and stalked back and forth within the clearing, kicking at loose stones and branches. He returned to the base of the rock as Saphira swooped down to the clearing. The talons on her hind legs cut deep gouges in the soft earth as she landed, back flapping to slow herself to a halt. Leaves and blades of grass swirled about her, as if caught in a whirlwind. Once she had dropped to all fours and folded her wings, the latter said, "I take it you did not aim in success." "No," snapped Aragon, and he glared at the spire. The old dragon seemed to sigh. "I was afraid this would be the case. There is only one explanation. That Solomon lied to us. That he sent us off on a wild chase so that the torrents could destroy the garden while we're gone. No, that in order to open this Vault of Souls," said Saphira. "Yes, this vault he told you about, that in order to open it, we must speak our true names." The words fell between them like weighty stones. For a time, none of them spoke. The thought intimidated Aragon, and he was reluctant to address it, as if doing so would somehow make the situation worse. "What if it's a trap?" said Saphira. "Then it is a most devilish trap," said Gladder. "The question you must decide is this: do you trust Solomon? For to proceed is to risk more than our lives, it is to risk our freedom. If you do trust him, can you be honest enough with yourselves to discover your true names, and quickly too? And are you willing to live with that knowledge, however unpleasant it might be?" Because if not, then we should leave this very moment. I have changed since Oromus's death, but I know who I am. Do you, Sarah? Do you, Aragon? Can you really tell me what it is that makes you the dragon and rider you are? Dismay crept through Aragon as he gazed up at the rock of Who am I? He wondered. And all the world a dream. Nisuda laughed as the starry sky spun around her and she fell tumbling toward a crevice of brilliant white light miles below. Wind tore at her hair, and her shift flapped wildly, the ragged ends of the sleeves snapping like whips. Great big bats, black and dripping, flocked about her, nipping at her wounds with teeth that cut and stabbed and burned like ice. And still she laughed. The crevice widened and the light engulfed her, blinding her for a minute. When her eyes cleared, she found herself standing in the hall of the soothsayer, looking at herself lying strapped to the ash-colored slab. Next to her limp body stood Galbatorix, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shadow where his face ought to be and a crown of crimson fire upon his head. He turned toward where she was standing and extended a gloved hand. Nisuda, daughter of a jihad. Unbend your pride and pledge your fealty to me, and I shall give you everything you have ever wanted. She uttered a derisive noise and lunged toward him with her hands outstretched. Before she could tear out his throat, the king vanished in a cloud of black mist. What I want is to kill you, she shouted toward the ceiling. The chamber rang with Galbatorix's voice as it emanated from every direction at once. Then here you shall stay until you realize the error of your ways. Nisuda opened her eyes. She was still on the slab, her wrists and ankles chained down and the wounds from the burrow rubbed throbbing as if they had never stopped. She frowned. Had she been unconscious, or had she just been talking with the king? It was so difficult to tell when. In one corner of the chamber, she saw the tip of a thick green vine force its way between the painted tiles, cracking them. More vines appeared next to the first. They poked through the wall from the outside and spread across the floor, covering a sea of writhing and snake-like appendages. Watching them crawl toward her, Nisuda began to chuckle. Is this all he can think of? I have stranger dreams nearly every night. As if in response to her scorn, the slab beneath her melted into the floor and the crashing tendrils closed over her, wrapping around her limbs and holding them more securely than any chains. Her sight grew dark as the vines atop her multiplied, and the only thing she could hear was the sound of them sliding against one another, a dry, shifting sound, like that of falling sand. The air around her grew thick and hot, and she felt as if she was having trouble breathing. Had she not known that the vines were only an illusion, she might have believed them. Instead, she spat into the darkness and cursed Galbatorix's name. Not for the first time. Nor for the last, she was sure, but she refused to allow him the pleasure of knowing he had unbalanced her. Light, golden sunbeams streaming across a series of rolling hills patched with fields and vineyards. She was standing by the edge of a small courtyard, underneath a trellis laden with blooming morning glories, the vines of which seemed uncomfortably familiar. She was wearing a beautiful yellow dress. There was a crystal goblet of wine in her right hand and the musky, cherry taste of wine upon her tongue. A slight breeze was blowing from the west. The air smelled of warmth and comfort and freshly tilled land. Ah, there you are, said a voice behind her, and she turned to see Murtaugh striding toward her from a grand estate. Like her, he held a goblet of wine. He was dressed in black hose and a doublet of maroon satin trimmed with gold piping. A gem-encrusted dagger hung from his studded belt. His hair was longer than she remembered, and he appeared relaxed and confident in a way she had not seen before. That, and the light upon his face, made him appear strikingly handsome, noble, even. He joined her under the trellis and placed a hand on her bare arm. The gesture seemed casual and intimate. You minx, abandoning me to Lord Pharaoh's and his interminable stories. It took me half an hour just to. Then he paused and looked at her closer, and his expression became more concerned. Are you feeling ill? Your cheeks look gray. She opened her mouth, but no words came to her. She could not think how to react. Murtaugh's brow furrowed. You had another one of your attacks, didn't you? I don't know. I can't remember how I got here, or, she trailed off as she saw the pain that appeared in Murtaugh's eyes, and which he quickly hid. He slid his hand down to the small of her back as he moved around her to stare out at the hilly landscape. With a swift motion, he drained his goblet. Then, in a low voice, he said, I know how confusing this is for you. It isn't the first time this has happened, but he took a deep breath and shook his head slightly. What is the last thing you remember? Tyr, Aberon, the siege of Cypri, the gift I gave seemed so real. The motion of Murtaugh's hair as the wind tousled it, the scent of the fields, the touch of her dress against her skin, it all seemed exactly as it should. But if she was actually there, then why hadn't Murtaugh reassured her that he reaching out in her mind, as he had done before? Had he forgotten? If 8 years had elapsed, he might not remember the promise he made to her so long ago in the hall of the soothsayer. "Aye," she started to say, and then she heard a woman call out. "My lady." She looked over her shoulder and saw a portly maid hurrying down from the estate, the front of her white apron flapping. "My lady," said the maid, and curtsied. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but the children hope you will watch them put on their play for the guests." "Children," she whispered. She looked back at Murtaugh to see his eyes shining with tears. "Aye," he said, "children. All strong and healthy and full of high spirits." She shuddered, overcome with emotion. She could not help it. Then she lifted her chin. "Show me what I have forgotten. Show me why I have forgotten." Murtaugh smiled at her with what seemed like pride. "It would be my pleasure," he said, and kissed her on the forehead. He took her goblet and gave both glasses to the maid. Then he grasped her hands in his, closed his eyes, and bowed his head. An instant later, she felt a presence pressing against her mind, and she knew that it was not him. It could never have been him. Angered by the deception and by the loss of what could never be, she pulled her right hand free of Murtaugh's, grabbed his dagger, and shoved the blade into his side. And she shouted. In El Harem, there lived a man with yellow eyes. "To me," he said, "beware the whispers, for they whisper lies." Murtaugh regarded her with a curiously blank expression, and then he faded away before her. Everything around her, the trellis, the courtyard, the estate, the hills with the vineyards, vanished, and she found herself floating in a void without light or sound. She tried to continue her litany, but no sound came from her throat. She could not even hear the pounding of the pulse in her veins. Then she felt the darkness twist, and she stumbled and fell onto her hands and knees. Sharp rocks scraped her palms. Blinking as her eyes adjusted to the light, she rose to her feet and looked around. Haze. Ribbons of smoke drifting across a barren field similar to the burning plains. She was once more clothed in her tattered shift, and her feet were bare. Something roared behind her, and she spun around to see a 12-foot-tall cull charging toward her, swinging an iron-bound club as large as she was. Another roar came from her left, and she saw a second cull, as well as 4 smaller urgles. Then a pair of cloaked, hunchbacked figures scurried out of the whitish haze and darted in her direction, chittering and waving their leaf-bladed swords. Although she had never seen them before, she knew they were the Rizak. She laughed again. Now Galbatorix was just trying to punish her. Ignoring the oncoming enemies, whom she knew she would never be able to kill or escape, she sat cross-legged on the ground and began to hum an old Cornish tune. Galbatorix's initial attempts to deceive her had been subtle affairs that might very well have succeeded in leading her astray had Murtaugh not warned her beforehand. To keep Murtaugh's help a secret, she had pretended to be ignorant of the fact that Galbatorix was manipulating her perception of reality, but regardless of what she saw or felt, she refused to allow the king to trick her into thinking of the things she should not, or, far worse, giving him her loyalty. Defying him had not always been easy, but she held to her rituals of thought and speech and, with them, she had been able to thwart the king. The first illusion had been of another woman, Rihanna, who joined her in the hall of the soothsayer as a fellow prisoner. The woman claimed she was secretly wedded to one of the Varden spies in Uruguay, and that she had been captured while carrying a message for him. Over what seemed like the course of a week, Rihanna tried to ingratiate herself with Nasuda and, in a sideways manner, convince her that the Vardens' campaign was doomed, that their reasons for fighting were flawed, and that it was only right and proper to submit to Galbatorix's authority. In the beginning, Nasuda had not realized that Rihanna herself was an illusion. She assumed that Galbatorix was distorting the woman's words or appearance, and hopes that he was taking her own emotions to make her more susceptible to Rihanna's arguments. As the days had dragged on, and Murtaugh neither visited nor contacted her, she had grown to fear that he had abandoned her to Galbatorix's clutches. The thought caused her more anguish than she would have liked to admit, and she found herself worrying about it at nearly every turn. Then she had begun to wonder why Galbatorix had not come to torture her every week, and it occurred to her that if a week had elapsed, then the Varden and the elves would have attacked Urubayan. And if that had happened, Galbatorix surely would have mentioned it, if only to gloat. Moreover, Riela's somewhat odd behavior, combined with a number of inexplicable gaps in her memory, Galbatorix's forbearance, and Murtaugh's continued silence, for she could not bring herself to believe that he would break his word to her, convinced her, as outlandish as it seemed, that Riela was an apparition and that time was no longer what it seemed. It had shaken her to realize that Galbatorix could alter the number of days she thought had passed. She loathed the idea. Her sense of time had grown vague during her imprisonment, but she had retained a general awareness of its passage. To lose that, to become unmoored in time, meant she was even more at Galbatorix's mercy, for he could prolong or contract her Still, she remained determined to resist Galbatorix. No matter how much time seemed to go by. If she had to endure then 100 years she would endure. When she had proven immune to Riela's insidious whisperings, and indeed finally denounced the woman for being a coward and a traitor, the figment was taken from her chamber, and Galbatorix moved on to another ploy. Thereafter, his deceptions had grown increasingly elaborate and improbable, but none broke the laws of reason and none conflicted with what he had already shown her, for the king was still trying to keep her ignorant of his meddling. His efforts culminated when he seemed to take her from the chamber to a dungeon cell elsewhere in the citadel, where she saw what appeared to be Aragon and Saphira bound in chains. Galbatorix had threatened to kill Aragon unless she swore fealty to him, the king. When she refused, much to Galbatorix's displeasure, and, she thought, his surprise, Aragon shouted a spell that somehow freed the king. After agreeing, Galbatorix fled, but she doubted he was in reality, and then she, Aragon, and Saphira started to fight outside the citadel. It had been rather dashing and exciting, and she had been tempted to find out how the sequence of events would resolve itself, but by then she felt she had played along with Galbatorix's false show for long enough. So she seized upon the first discrepancy she noticed, the shape of the scales around Saphira's eyes, and used it as an excuse to feign a realization that the world around her was only a pretense. "You promised you would not lie to me while I was in the hall of the soothsayer," she had shouted into the air. "What is this but a lie, oath-breaker?" Galbatorix's wrath at her discovery had been prodigious. She had heard a growl like that of a mountain-sized dragon, and then he abandoned all subtlety, and for the rest of the session was subjecting her to a series of fantastical torments. At last the apparitions had ceased, and Murtaugh had contacted her to let her know she could once again trust her senses. She had never been so happy to feel the touch of his mind. That night, he had come to her, and they spent hours sitting together and talking. He told her of the Varden's progress, they were nearly upon the capital, and of the Empire's preparations. He had discovered a means of freeing her. When she pressed him for details, he refused to elaborate, saying, "I need another day or two to see if it will work. But there is a way, Nasuda. Take heart in that." She had taken heart in Nasuda's concern. Even if she never escaped, she was not in captivity. After she recounted some of the things Galbatorix had done to her and the means by which she had foiled him, Murtaugh chuckled. "You've proven more of a challenge than he anticipated. It's been a long time since anyone has given him this much of a fight." "I certainly didn't. I understand little about it, but I know it's incredibly difficult to create believable illusions. Any competent magician can make it seem as if you're floating in the sky or that you're cold or hot or that there's a flower growing in front of you. Small complicated things or large simple things are the most difficult person can hope to create, and it requires a great deal of concentration to maintain the illusion. If for a touching favors, all of a sudden the flower has 4 petals instead of 10. Or it might vanish altogether. Details are the hardest thing to replicate. Nature is filled with infinite details, but our minds can only hold so much. If you're ever in doubt as to whether what you're seeing is real, look at the details. Look for the seams in the world, where the spellcaster either does not know or has forgotten what should be there, or has taken a shortcut to conserve energy. If it's so difficult, then how does Galbatorix manage it? He's using the Eldenari. All of them? Murtaugh nodded. They provide the energy and the details needed, and he directs them as he wants. "So then, the things I see are built on the memories of dragons?" she asked, feeling slightly odd. He nodded again. "That and the memories of their riders, for those who had riders." The following morning, Murtaugh had woken her with a sore cold and brought to tell her that Galbatorix was about to start again. Thereafter, phantoms and illusions of every sort had beset her, but as the day wore on, she noticed that the visions, with a few notable exceptions, such as that of her and Murtaugh at the estate, had grown and simple, as if either Galbatorix or the Eldenari were growing tired. And now she sat upon the barren plain, having ignored to his column, Urgles, and Rizak bore down on her. They caught her, and it felt as if they beat and cut her, and at times she screamed and wished to leave her. Not once did she consider giving in to Galbatorix's desires. Then the plain vanished, as did most of her suffering, and she reminded herself, "It is only in my mind. I shall not be ill. I am not an animal. I am stronger than the weakness in my flesh." A dark cave lit by glowing green mushrooms appeared around her. For several minutes, she heard a large creature snuffling and padding about in the shadows between the stalagmites, and then she felt the creature's warm breath against the back of her neck, and she smelled the odor of carrion. She started to laugh again, and she continued to laugh even as Galbatorix forced her to continue after horror in an attempt to find the particular combination of pain and fear that would break her. She laughed because she knew her will was stronger than his imagination, and she laughed because she knew she could count on Murtaugh's help, and with him as her ally, she did not fear the spectral nightmares Galbatorix inflicted upon her, no matter how terrible they seemed at the time. Question of character. Aragon's foot slipped out from him as he stepped on a patch of slick mud, and he fell onto his side in the wet grass with brutal suddenness. He uttered a grunt and winced as his hip began to throb. The impact was sure to leave a bruise. "Barzel," he said as he rolled to his feet and carefully stood. "At least I didn't land on Reisinger," he thought as he pried scales of cold mud from his leggings. Feeling glum, he resumed trudging toward the ruined building where they had decided to camp, in the belief it would be safer than by the forest. As he strode through the grass, he startled a number of bullfrogs, who sprang out of hiding and fled hopping to either side. The bullfrogs were the only other strange creature they had encountered on the island. Each had a horn-like projection above its reddish eyes, and from the center of its forehead sprouted a curving stalk, much like a fisherman's rod, upon the end of which hung a small, fleshy organ that at night glowed either white or yellow. The light allowed the bullfrogs to lure hundreds of flying insects within the reach of their tongues, and as a result of their easy access to food, the frogs grew enormously large. He had seen some the size of a bear's head, great fleshy lumps with staring eyes and mouths as wide as both his outstretched hands put together. The frogs reminded him of Angela the herbalist, and he suddenly wished that she were there on Groingard Island with them. If anyone could tell us our true names, I bet she could. For some reason, he always felt that the herbalist would see right through him, as if she understood everything about him. It was a disconcerting sensation, but at the moment, he would have welcomed it. He and Saphira had decided to trust Solumbum and stay on Groingard for another 3 days at most while they tried to discover their true names. The latter had left the decision to them, he said. "You know Solumbum better than I do. Stay or do not. Either way, the risk is great. There are no more safe paths." It was Saphira who ultimately made the choice. The werecats would never serve Galbatorix, she said. They prize their freedom too highly. I would trust their word before that of any other creature, even an elf. So they had stayed. They spent the rest of that day, and now most of the next, sitting, thinking, talking, sharing, examining each other's minds, and trying various combinations of words in the ancient language, all in the hope that they would be able to either consciously work out their terms or, if they were lucky, strike upon them by accident. Bladder had offered his help when asked, but for the most part he kept to himself and gave Aragon and Saphira privacy for their conversations, many of which Aragon would have been embarrassed for anyone else to hear. The finding of one's true name ought to be something one does for oneself, said Bladder. "If I think of either of yours, I will tell you, for we have no time to waste, but it would be better if you discover them on your own." Possibly, he had succeeded. Ever since Brahm had explained to him about true names, Aragon had wanted to know his own. Knowledge, particularly self-knowledge, was a and he hoped his true name would allow him to better master his tasks and abilities. Still, he could not help but feel a certain amount of trepidation about what he might discover. Assuming that he could discover his name without his own name, which he was not entirely sure. He hoped that he would devote his success in their mission, as he did not want Bladder or Saphira to think the wrong of him. If he was to hear his whole being described in a word or phrase, then he wanted to arrive at that knowledge on his own, instead of having it forced upon him. Aragon sighed as he climbed the 5 broken steps that led up to the building. The structure had been a nesting house, or so Bladder had said, and by the standards of Groingard, it was so small as to be entirely unnoteworthy. Still, the walls were over 3 stories high, and the interior was large enough for Saphira to move about with ease. The southeastern corner had collapsed inward, taking part of the ceiling with it, but otherwise the building was sound. Aragon's steps echoed as he walked through the vaulted entryway and made his way across the glassy floor of the main chamber. Embedded within the transparent material were swirling bodies of color that formed an abstract design of dizzying complexity. Every time he looked at it, he felt as if the lines were about to resolve into a recognizable shape, but they never did. The surface of the floor was covered with a fine web of cracks that radiated outward from the rubble beneath the gaping hole where the walls had given way. Long tendrils of ivy hung from the edges of the broken ceiling like lengths of knotted rope. Water dripped from the ends of the vines to fall into shallow, misshapen puddles, and the sound of the droplets striking echoed throughout the building, a constant, irregular beat that Aragon thought would drive him mad if he had to listen to it for more than a few days. Against the north-facing wall was a half-circle of stones Saphira had dragged and pushed into place to protect their camp. When he reached the barrier, Aragon jumped onto the nearest block, which stood over 6 feet tall. Then he dropped down to the other side, landing heavily. Saphira paused in the midst of licking her forefoot, and he felt a questioning thought from her. He shook his head, and she returned to her grooming. Undoing his cloak, Aragon walked over to the fire he had held close to the wall. He spread the sodden garment on the floor, then removed his mud-caked boots and set them out to dry as well. Does it look as if it will start raining again? Saphira asked. Probably. He squatted by the fire for a bit, and then sat on the table. He watched Saphira as she worked her crimson tongue around the flexible cuticle at the base of each of her talons. An idea occurred to him, and he murmured a phrase in the ancient language, but to his disappointment, he felt no charge of energy in the words, nor did Saphira react to the as that sounding Aragon had spoken his true name. Aragon closed his eyes and put his head back. It frustrated him that he was unable to puzzle out Saphira's true name. He could accept that he did not fully understand himself, but he had known Saphira since the moment she had left, and he had shared nearly all of her memories. How could there be parts of her that were still a mystery to him? How could he have been better able to understand a murderer like Sloane than his own spellbonded partner? Was it because she was a dragon and he was a human? Was it because Sloane's identity had been simpler than Saphira's? Aragon did not know. One of the exercises he and Saphira had done, on Gladder's recommendation, was to tell each other all of the flaws that they noticed, he in her and she in him. It had been a humbling exercise. Gladder had also shared his observations, and though the dragon had been kind, Aragon could not help but feel a sense of wounded pride upon hearing Gladder list his various failings. And that too Aragon knew he needed to take into account in terms of his Saphira, the hardest thing to come to terms with had been her vanity, which she had refused to acknowledge as such for the longest time. For Aragon, it had been the arrogance Gladder claimed he sometimes displayed, his feelings concerning the men he had killed, and all the petulance, selfishness, anger, and other shortcomings to which he, like so many others, was prey. And yet, though they had examined themselves